Imagine that you are planning a vacation. And in this case, let's say your vacation spot is Baguio. I've heard it's a vacation spot. I haven't been there, right? It's popular. Okay. And you've been planning this vacation for a while. Yeah. You just want to get away from work, have a nice weekend, right? And when you start driving around halfway, you realize you've developed a cold. And not only that, it started to rain like cats and dogs. And to make matters worse, the traffic is also stuck. And now you've been stuck in one place for more than 2 hours. Does that sound like a familiar scenario in the Philippines? Okay. What is your next course of action? What would you do in that situation? So Chidi says she's going to meditate. Does anyone else have any idea what would they have done in that situation? I think Mir wants to say something.
If depending on the state of the traffic condition, if it's not moving, then I have to stay put. I cannot leave my car behind. But if it's moving, I'll probably head to the nearest hotel and rest. That's what I would do.
Okay, so Mir says she's going to head to the nearest hotel and rest. Yes, KB?
Hi, Prof. I would find an alternate route.
You'll find an alternate route. Okay. And so you're determined to have this holiday, regardless of the fact that you have a cold.
Yes, Prof. Because I've experienced that in the province where there was like a lockdown in traffic for like more than just 2 hours. So it's really annoying and it's raining hard. So as much as possible, I want to get out of the traffic jam because I do not want to get caught in the flood if ever it floods.
Right. But in this situation, you're stuck in traffic. Yes, Senate.
I'll probably do the same thing as what Mir just said. I'll find like a hotel or a place that I can stay in and just do a staycation instead of vacation.
Okay, so you're not moving forward to Baguio then. You're staying where you are.
It depends. Where am I now, Prof?
Okay. Good. So it seems like most of you have a consensus on a staycation. How many of you would raise your hands want to move forward, proceed to Baguio? Okay. So I see a few hands raised. Just one hand raised online. So Curdy says she's going to proceed. So does Andre, Carl, Candy, like of them, right? How many of you want to have a staycation, depending on where you are? Zenith and KB. Okay, G, 2D. Okay. Okay. And how many of you would be like, you know what? I can have this vacation later on. I should just head back to Manila. So 2D says she would consider it.
I could consider, yeah.
Okay.
Depending on what comes out during meditation.
Okay. So have you ever had an experience in your life where you were dead set on doing something and then somewhere you realized, you know what, going forward with this could be self-destructive? So I'm hearing a yes from pretty much everybody. Okay. How many of you decided to go forward with your original plan of action despite knowing that this was self-destructive because you really wanted it? A few people, right? Okay. And did you, in hindsight, despite knowing the fact that this would be self-destructive, find yourself in a place where you did actually self-destruct in a way? Yes, there's at least one yes. Zen is like, no, I would never do that. Okay. Zenit, what about you? Have you ever found yourself in that situation? And did you ever say no? It seems like it.
Yeah, I think I've tried pursuing one course of action, and initially I thought it was a bad idea. But um maybe it's just my perspective. Everything is just character building characters. So
Okay. So you thought it was a bad idea, and then did you stop, or did you just like be like, I know it's a bad idea, but might as well just go ahead.
yeah, that's what I did. Oh, that's why I'm a lawyer now.
So that was a bad idea, going to law school? Okay. Okay. So we've just discovered that going to law school is self-destructive.
Yes.
Uh,
Actually, we're referring to the same situation.
so is joining the MIBL program also self-destructive?
Since I have not graduated yet, it's not a bad idea.
Okay. Okay. So you don't know about the economic impact of joining the MIBL program just yet. Okay. So we'll find out when you're looking for an upgrade in your career and you try to sell your MIBL elsewhere. Okay. So the reason I'm talking about this is because at some point in your career, if you have a project planned, you will have to make some sort of decision, right? Especially if you think that this project is something that the company needs or is lucrative, right? Have you ever been in that situation where a company you're working for has some project planned and there is potentially some sort of benefit to this project when you conceptualize it? Okay. When you start conceptualizing these processes, do you have you ever reached a point where you started thinking about, okay, I know that there are some benefits, but then as we are planning this project, there are things that we did not see that are now coming up. Okay, Candy, I see you really nodding your head about something, and I want to hear about what that was.
Okay, so this happened recently. Um, our company wanted to not really diversify because it is in our line of business, but we wanted a business. How do you call it? What the But we wanted to explore the option of like cargo handling and cargo transportation. We- Our business is, by the way, yes, logistics. Our business is, by the way, land transportation. So it's buses and we carry passengers. So we wanted to engage with another bus company, but for logistics. And then I don't know. I was not actually with the planning team, but they asked me with regards my opinion on, like, example, because the other bus company wanted to the I mean the what do you call this? The arrangement is that bus company would get the cargoes from their customers, and then these cargoes would be, they contract us to um, transport these cargoes to a certain area that is within our area of operation. So when they asked me, I said yes, that's a good arrangement, but this the other bus company wanted us to give them an official receipt, and that that uh, our problem came about because the other bus company
since they're already doing that, they're already bus registered, and I mean VAT registered, sorry. But us, we remained in the business of land transportation. So our taxes was on was 3% common carriers tax. We're not VAT registered. So the other company, since they are VAT registered, they wanted us to have this VAT receipt so they can claim the input VAT from our transaction. So when our CEO asked me, I said to him, what is our risk appetite on this? Because if we will be changing our tax type from only a common carrier's tax to common carrier's tax, 3%, and VAT. So yeah, that's it.
Okay.
That's the problem. And then I gave them the option. Yes, that's one option, that we create another company to handle the logistics transaction. But the CEO that didn't want it.
So you pushed forward.
It seems that they would like to push forward the transaction, and they wouldn't want to get my ideas already.
Okay. So what ended up happening? Have you seen any consequences?
I think the logistics business hasn't started yet, but they are planning to start it this May. So let's see.
And you can foresee a disaster.
Yes.
That's what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. But at the organizational level, you see that there is no mindfulness,
Sort of.
sort of, right? Okay. So how do you go about assessing the fact that there's a risk?
What do you mean? The criteria
Yeah.
that I use to assess the risk?
Yes.
I just know that there is a risk because the other bus company, they are declaring their sales, and then they are strict about it.
Mm.
And then this is a new line of business for us. So if we don't follow what the other company is doing, like declaring their vatable sales like that, it will be a problem for us because they will be listing us as their supplier of service. So that's what I thought of. If we do not register this line of business and we do not put VAT, I mean, subject that transaction to VAT, we will probably be under BIR scrutiny.
Okay. I have in front of me a word, pestle. Can you see it? It's not that clear. Let me just pastel. Okay. Not that clear, but PESTLE. This is how you identify your risk, broadly speaking. Political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental framework, right? So this is a common problem when you have organizational level decision making done, right? So you look at it, you know that there's something could go wrong, but how do you categorize those things? Now, going back to your problem, where would you put your risk?
On the legal side.
On the legal side,
Yes.
right? Did you know about this framework already?
Not yet. I
Okay.
just heard from.
Has
I
it
just
helped
heard-
you
Actually,
identify
yes.
what needs to be solved?
Yes. Actually.
Okay. So broadly speaking, when we look at this particular course, it really is a course in risk management. There are a few courses that you'll come across in your MIBL program that are like really specifically focused on risk management. You'll have the business liability and insurance course later on as well. You'll have cybersecurity, right? But broadly speaking, a lot of what you'll cover in the program will be about, yeah, risk management, right? In this case, what we're looking at today are environmental projects. In, construction projects, things that people decide to build and then, need to understand, will there be an environmental impact to this? And should we continue with these projects, right? And so what you need to do if you have such projects are have environmental impact assessments, right? So we're going to cover today the historical development and legal foundations of environmental impact assessments. We're going to look at it in the context of international law. I've given you a case to read, the pulp mills case on the Uruguay River. We're going to talk about that case in the context of international environmental law. And we're going to evaluate different EIA requirements in major jurisdictions and international instruments. And we're going to apply EIA principles to cross-border operations and develop strategies for effective environmental assessments in international projects. And I actually have a class activity for you that will include coming up with an environmental impact assessment for an actual project that is going on right now in the world. Okay, so what is an EIA? It's the process of evaluating, right? So it's a process. It's not just a document, right? It's a process of evaluating the likely environmental impacts of a proposed project or development, taking into account interrelated socioeconomic, cultural, and human health impacts, both beneficial and adverse. So it's very, it's sort of like economic analysis of a project. Like, is there a cost or a benefit? Is there a social cost, health cost, environmental cost or benefit? This is what you're basically doing in your environmental impact assessment, right? So how will it impact soil quality, soil erosion? How will it impact land and air, water, wildlife, so on and so forth? How will it impact the broader community? Now, there are different stages for conducting an environmental impact assessment. The first really is to get the right licenses. Work with the local authority if you wanted to get a project improved. Like if you were working in the Philippines and you wanted to construct a large project, where would you look for licenses? And what type of licenses would you be looking for? Yes, Dodi?
The one handling environmental matters is in the cabinet, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources.
DNR.
So, yes, ma'am. And they have, I think, an Environmental Management Bureau,
Yes, they do. EMB.
EMB. Yes, ma'am. It's a big bureaucracy.
Yes, that's true. Okay. And what about the local level? Do you need local permits? Yes, Senate.
So whenever a person would want to build or construct anything, they have to get permits from the local government units, specifically in the places wherein they will build or construct the thing.
Okay. I see Derek raising his hand.
Hello, Prof. Yes, actually, our projects encounter this kind of the EIA certificate. As Dodi mentioned, we have to go with the DNR to obtain the ECC. We call the ECC, Environment Compliance Certificate, something. But
Yeah.
actually, I have a question here. Is some of the investors they will request for the like the IFC standard ECC or EIA certificate. I really want to know what is the difference between IFC standard and the local standard. And also for me, it's only I think the price difference and also the scopings difference.
Actually, I'm not familiar with can you repeat it, Derek, the other document that you mentioned,
ECC you mean or IFC standard?
IFC standard.
Yes.
IFC is a foreign body, correct?
Yes, yes. It's a international like
and
funding.
and the Department of Environment is asking for a certification from the IFC. Is that correct?
No, I mean
Oh.
for the DNR, they only request for the ECC, right?
Alright.
The Environment Compliance Certificate. But some of the foreign investors, they will request for IFC standard ECC. That's the different, I think, the criteria compared with the local government.
Right. So this depends. With sometimes you will have these foreign investors who are registered in Europe, for example, you know, in the EU, and they are very stringent about the sort of projects that they have in place. And we're going to get into this when we talk about supply chain management, right? So if you are an EU registered company or a UK registered company, there are even if you're operating overseas, you need to be compliant according to their standards rather than local standards. And the reason for this is that they're concerned that the local standards will not be as good as the international standards that they have in place. And there's also a concern that if you're working in a developing country, people can get bribed at the local level, right? So they want to ensure harmonization and like standardization. So that's why they'll sometimes ask that you have an international standard in place. Does that make sense, Derek?
Just a clarification on that, ma'am. Because they have no jurisdiction in the Philippines, they cannot come here, the IFC. So what they'll do is just examine the criteria.
Yes,
do
I mean,
they send
just because they don't have jurisdiction here doesn't mean that they don't have jurisdiction over the company
Over the
where it's
company, yes.
registered.
Yes. But
So-
what will they be examining? The ECC here and compare it to their ECC? Is that no factual investigation?
Mostly there will be factual investigation.
So they will come
If
here.
you want to have that international standard in place, then they'll have their own investigation.
So they will
period.
come here.
Yes.
Incognito.
Yes, you'll see this happening, even if you're trying to set up not an environmental project, but something like a back payment project as well here in the Philippines, right? Like if you want to have a back payment office, a lot of times you will have investigation teams coming, inspection teams coming here, checking how your employees are set up, how are your offices, what type of salaries are you paying them, right? So you will actually have, if the company is large enough, they will come if they want to be, you know, if they're a foreign entity that is working here in the Philippines, most likely they do have that money, and they, you know, the auditors will also want to come and see independently what you have in place, because this could lead to significant compliance challenges for them.
I'm just wondering if they will coordinate with the local authorities or no more. They will come incognito here.
As
Yes, I think there is some like the local authority, the third parties who
Yeah.
also can provide the IFC standard ECC certification.
it depends, right? I mean, it also depends on reliability and trust.
Time, ma'am. I just want to make sure that, of course, we have sovereignty in this jurisdiction.
Yes, I mean, these are concerns, but locally normally they will work with local authorities, because obviously if you're not doing it, then you run into other legal issues, right? What is a foreign auditor doing here, you know, assessing our, you know, operations here? So normally they will have some sort of coordination
yes.
going on, right? And
Thanks, ma'am.
and I was just discussing this in the cybersecurity class. What you normally will have, even if there is no specific treaty that deals with this, is a mutual legal assistance treaty, right? So between different countries, where especially if you're concerned that there could be like a criminal action involved, or some other negligence-based action involved, you can have like cross-border investigations. Yes, Zenith.
In the case of the Philippines, for example, Professor DPWH, Department of Public Works and Highways, they adopted IFC as a standard for green sustainability. Also for BSP, they also adopted the IFC standards for sustainability taxonomy.
Yeah, I mean, it's also because even if you're a local agency or a local entity and you have, procurements coming from abroad, and by the way, this is a thing, even in international trade, you can't discriminate between who you're getting procurements from in certain treaties, right? So you want to show foreign investors or foreign companies that are coming here, we have some standards in place, right? We have some commitments. We want to show that we're as good as the rest of the world, we're as transparent, we're as reliable as any other country that you would want to do business in. Does that make sense?
I cannot disagree with that, ma'am.
Okay, that's good. Right. So getting back to the EIA process. So you look at what you need at the base level, what's the scope of the project. You start by screening what exactly is the project about. Is it really something that we need, right? Then you do like baseline studies of existing environmental conditions. You get your engineers, scientists involved, local people who are experts in this, and then you do a risk assessment, right? So you analyze, you make predictions as to what is going to be the impact of this project, come up with different models depending on where you're situated, right? In some countries, you might actually be asked to come up with simulations as to the worst case scenario before you even start doing start building or go ahead with the process. This depends though, depends on where you are, right? Because in a lot of developing countries, what tends to happen is that the project will start first and the IAA will come later.
Could be an indicator of corruption too, right?
For what? Which
Because if the project goes ahead without the proper documentation, then that would signal something not scrupulous.
yes, potentially bribery, something else, right? But it is quite common. Sometimes the problem, at least in Pakistan, what we say is the problem with Pakistan is not corruption, it is incompetence.
I have Pakistani friends who are very intelligent.
Well, yeah, I mean, listen, I'm Pakistani, I'm a proud Pakistani, but the thing is, like, at the government level, there's a reason why you have Pakistanis who are doing well abroad and they're not sitting in their own country, right? Because you have these really bureaucratic systems that are in place from the British times. Like there's this Charles Dickens novel called Bleak House about how messed up the legal system in the UK was, and there's a particular point about a government agency that is called the Department of Circumambulation. Does that ring a bell? Have you ever seen the Department of Circumambulation working in the Philippines in the guise of another agency? So what happens when you circumambulate? You go round and round and round, trying to get one thing from another, right? And so unfortunately, this is sometimes what will happen. Like there'll be a lot of bureaucratic red tape, things that will become unnecessarily difficult, right? And so coming back to the question of incompetence, what will happen a lot of times is that you'll work in jurisdictions where you realize they're not really concerned about international standards, or it comes more of like an afterthought. It's not something that they would put in place the first time. It's not even something that is malicious. They just don't realize that, maybe we should have done this the first time around when we were coming with this project. So it really depends, where you're at, because really with a lot of developing countries, the EIA will come a lot later, even though that should be the first thing. And again, if you want to be working with international companies, the EIA will come first, and they might have requirements in their home jurisdictions which actually require that you have these in place before you start a project. Otherwise, if there's litigation, and in some jurisdictions, you have like alien torch statutes, like even the United States, where you can have foreign nationals coming and suing, who are impacted by a project outside the US by a US company, and they will decide to sue that company in the US, right? So you have this. You also have in the US what is known as the FCPA. This was enacted, I believe, sometime in the 1970s, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So if you are engaged in any kickbacks outside the US, bribery, anything else that signifies local corruption, international corruption, you can actually get sued in the US for this. Why? Because at least back in the 60s, 70s, the US used to care about its international reputation and about how scrupulous it seemed. That is obviously not the case now, because they have a convicted felon in government as we speak, right? So they don't really care that much about, and happens to be a businessman of all people, right? So we know now that there is capitalist surveillance going on in the US. We have like corrupt businessmen who are in power. So the US doesn't really care that much about that reputation. I mean, surprisingly, there's similar developments in other developed countries happen much later. So for example, the UK passed its Bribery Act in just 2010, I believe, 2008, 2010, very recent comparatively. And the reason for this was they really didn't care what their British companies were doing outside, and they were sort of forced into signing this act by the US because there were US companies that were working with UK companies, and they were concerned about how they would look, and they didn't want to really do this work, right? So anyway, getting back to this, environmental impact assessments, you have number 3, risk assessments. You also consider alternatives. Do I really need this project? If I am indeed going to move ahead with this project, are there other ways of doing this that would have less of an environmental impact, less of a social impact, right? And if there are going to be adverse impacts, how can I mitigate, right? This is even before you start the project. And if this is something that's going to impact the public, do I want the public to be involved in this? And in some cases, there's actually legislation, and we'll get into this in a bit, where you are required in certain jurisdictions to have public participation. There are so for example, the USMCA, the United States, Canada, and Mexico Free Trade Agreement, it actually mandates public participation, especially if there are cross-border initiatives that impact local people. You'll have public hearings, people can submit their concerns. And so in some cases, you might be mandated to do this, right? And then once the project is approved, you'll also have to keep on monitoring, because the law of unintended consequences, there are things that regardless of how well the project is planned, when you start executing it, things will come up that you never foresaw. Okay, so in terms of, getting to the nitty gritties of the local acts, we find the first requirement to have an environmental impact assessment in the US with its National Environmental Policy Act 1969, which created also a Council on Environmental Quality and then established the requirement of having an environmental impact statement. The Philippines, despite being a developing country, was actually one of the first countries to require having environmental impact assessments. And so this was done in, I think, 1978. So Colombia and the Philippines, some of the first few countries to actually require having these in place. And so you can see that there were like presidential decrees which require sponsors of projects affecting the quality of the environment to prepare EIAs. You have different rules and regulations. So the Philippines is actually quite ahead in this. There was also, if you look at the last memorandum, you'll also see that you have now also incorporated disaster risk reduction into your EIAs and also climate change adaptations. And as Dodi mentioned, you have the EMB division of DENR. And at the international level, the requirement for EIAs happened a little later, right? So you have the World Bank, which adopted EIA procedures. So if the World Bank is going to fund any projects, they will also require an EIA. I'm personally not a big fan of banks because regardless of what they're doing, of how nice they decide like want to look with all this like talk on sustainable banking, at the end of the day, the system is exploitative. But if they want to feel good about themselves, sure, yeah, I know you'll hear a lot about sustainable finance here at AIM, of how amazing it is. You're probably already hearing a lot about it. Right? But it's my personal opinion. Anyway,
Ma'am, but we have to know.
yeah. No, listen, if you've taken a loan from the IMF or the World Bank, you're in big trouble. And there is no way you're getting out of it anytime soon or anytime, or it's not going to be an easy bargain to get out of. Right? So regardless of how the World Bank wants to monitor you, wants to tell you, if you're being a good kid, I will give you the money, right? The fact is that in most cases, the developing nations that are taking these funds end up working a lot harder and still end up making less, right? So you'll have people who are in the economy that are working for peanuts, just trying to pay off these debts, right? And they'll never get out of this system. So even if a project is environmentally sustainable, you are stuck with generational debt. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, you're in a debt trap. So I'm sorry, but it is what it is. Now, in 1991, you have the United Nations passed the ESPU Convention on Transboundary Environmental Impact Assessments, which sets up a process for how you should conduct these, if there's a project that is going to affect two countries, how do you go about doing the environmental impact assessments? Well, the ESPU Convention gives you a framework for this, right? So you notify the other party, you sit down, you ask them, okay, we're going to start this project. The other party then tells you, okay, this is how we feel about this project. It's going to impact us in this way. And if the outcome is that it's going to have a negative impact, maybe it's time to negotiate and say, you know what, this is not going to work. If not, then this will get escalated to the International Court of Justice, right? And so even if you have these negotiations, it will be sometimes a requirement that you have public participation in these transboundary projects, right? A lot of these projects can be dams, they can be barrages. Can you think of any other transboundary projects that would require bridges? Okay, what else? Sorry? Trains? Okay, trains is a good one. Yes, Mir.
Maybe tunnels.
Tunnels.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Pipelines? Right? Gas pipelines? Okay, so we have a good sense of this. Now, the examples we've come up with are between two countries that are normally neighboring each other. Is that the case? Okay. What if there is a project going on in Switzerland that impacts the Philippines? Can the Philippines, if there's a project that could have potential climate implications, can the Philippines request that Switzerland come and sit with them on the table and have an environmental impact assessment done? There's no neighboring between the Philippines and Switzerland that I know of. Can the Philippines ask the Switzerland to sit on the table and have a discussion about this project?
Same with Attorney Dodi. We can try as long as there is a basis as to why we will sit and discuss. There should be a reference point.
Yes. So there has been increasingly developing jurisprudence according to which you don't need to share your boundaries with a country to object to a project and ask for an environmental impact assessment to be done, as long as you can reasonably argue that there is scientific evidence that this project is going to harm you. You can have you actually use the ESPO convention to get an EIA done, right? And you can actually escalate this case to the International Court of Justice. Now, in terms of other international evolutions, we know from the Rio Declaration, if we look at Principle 17, that states are required to have environmental impact assessments. So that has further become a part of international law. And then in 1998, we have something called the Aarhus Convention. Has anyone ever heard about this? Okay, this is going to become more relevant to you when you start studying data privacy laws. If somebody asks you, Is all data private? What would be your answer? No. Okay. What type of data is public and should be public?
Ma'am, just I'll try, ma'am. In
Yes.
the Philippines, let's say public documents like
Mhm.
laws are not private, they're
What
public.
what type of public document? Sorry?
Statutory law,
Laws. Okay.
constitution,
Right.
they are of judicial notice in courts. So you don't need to have access or special access for that because
Yeah.
it's available.
Okay. What if I was to tell you that environmental data also belongs to the public?
If they are factual.
Well, regardless, if the
meaning-
government has collected this, right, then you have a right to ask for it. And how do we know this? Because this is what the Aarhus Convention is about. You have a right to access public environmental data, meteorological data. If you're concerned about climate change and you think that the government is not acting, or you know that something else is going to be off, you have a right to ask for this, right? And then also you have a right to participate publicly in any projects that will impact you as a citizen, right? And you have the right to ask for information about those projects that are underway. As a normal citizen, you can actually do this, right? So that's, this is also a part of international law. Then you have the UNEP goals and principles for international environmental assessments. I will get to that in a bit.
Ma'am, is
Okay.
that a treaty law or is it customary norms of
It's a convention.
treaty?
Yeah.
And if the Philippines is a state party, then we are bound by that.
Yeah.
But there is also in our constitution the states that transparency has limitations. There is a right of information, but it is not unlimited. It can be limited by the state too. So there appears to be a clash between the constitution. and
That's a really good question. And we have a resource speaker coming next week, Chantal Echo, who is also a documentary maker. And I think she'll go into a lot of detail as to what happens here, at the local level, where sometimes you will have government agencies partnering with corporations, coming up with projects. And even if you have journalists who are trying to investigate these projects, sometimes they will actually have their lives endangered. And if they want to make that information public, that also becomes like it's a double-edged sword. Like getting the information, access to that information can be dangerous, and also making that information public can be quite dangerous as well. I don't want to say too much about that because I'm not as privy to the local context as she is, but I think she'll have a lot to say about what happens here. And you can totally, well, I would, you may want to use those words more carefully.
No, meaning examiner by oral, not oral examination, like
physical
direct
examination, I hope.
cross examination, not physical. Andre has a right to, he has a right to touch. He's a PT. So he sometimes tell his patient, he tell the patient that I'm authorized by law, by the state to touch you. Kidding, ma'am.
I think the right word was maybe interrogate.
Yes, ma'am. Let me correct myself. I take back everything I said and replace it with interrogate.
Because this is getting recorded, I don't want you to be later a part of a law.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for that.
Ma'am, since I'm from HR, I will interview.
Okay. So we have the ESPO convention. We also have the Convention on Biodiversity, which mandates environmental impact assessments. We have the United Nations Conventions on the sea, If there's like any marine impact, that also will require an EIA. And then obviously I've already discussed NAFTA, which is the precursor to the USMCA. And then you have EU directives about projects that are going on in the EU or you know, or being directed by EU companies elsewhere. Okay, in terms of customary international law, there, even if you did not have these treaties, you could still have claims to environmental impact assessments. Why? Because you have the prevention principle in place, right? If you can foresee that there's going to be a harm, you should try to not go ahead with a project that is bad, right? Again, going back to, you know, risk management and mindfulness. If you know that there will be inconsistencies or illegalities in a project going forward, you also have due diligence obligations. Tied to all of this is the precautionary approach, you know, better to be safe than sorry. And then obviously, because we're talking about, you know, interstate cooperation, you should, if there's a potential impact, you know, customary international law says, please talk to each other before messing each other's company, jurisdiction up. Okay. So yeah, we've already covered this: notification, transmission, consultation, public participation, consideration of town's boundary impacts, and then project monitoring. Now, what we've covered sounds really good, right? Ideally, people should come to a table and sit together and talk to each other nicely. But if that was always the case, we would have no laws. We would have no courts, right? And we would have no prisons or penalties, right? So even if the law mandates it, it's possible that you still end up with disputes between countries because they could have different procedures in their own jurisdictions as to when, you know, they're getting local permits, different requirements. Obviously, one project that would be considered, you know, maybe not such a big deal, could be a big deal for the other people, you know, depends on the sensitivity levels of people. Then there could also be limitations as to data sharing, right? That sometimes if you're asking one jurisdiction to share information about what they have, they might consider it to be a breach of their sovereignty. It's also possible that one country has more capacity than the other country, right? So they might not even have the resources to conduct an environmental impact assessment the way that a developed country would, right? And this is what I've heard from, you know, people who work in developing countries, including in the Philippines, Pakistan. A lot of times, it's not that the government employees don't know that there's a problem. A lot of times the problem is that they don't have the resources, right, to be working as diligently or doing as much work as they would like, because they're really quite constrained, right? So if even if you want some sort of like cross-boundary collaboration, you might be restricted in how you go about doing this. Okay, so sovereignty concerns, obviously, if there's a breach, right, and there is an environmental breach, and you understand that somebody's been negligent, somebody's acting criminally, there might be different enforcement mechanisms in different countries. Like just today, I was talking about Thailand and the Philippines. Quite close to each other, right? But are their systems, are the legal systems similar? Are they different?
In the form of government, it's a monarchy, I think, Thailand.
Yeah, as far as I understand, Thailand was never really colonized, has always been a kingship, right? Whereas the Philippines, completely different story, right? You had Spanish rule, you had American rule, we Pakistanis had British rule, right? So, and we still have a lot of the same British laws in place, and it's the same with India, right? And also with Myanmar, it's literally the same. You have the same contract act in Myanmar, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, partnerships act, same thing, right? So you have different enforcement mechanisms. So there might be like disparities as to how something gets enforced or to the extent of which something gets enforced, right? And like who it gets enforced on. So like just earlier today, we were having a discussion about the age of majority, right? So if somebody decides to act negligently, they might be considered a minor in one jurisdiction and a major and an adult in another jurisdiction, right? So who do you hold responsible and how do you hold responsible, right? So all of this, and obviously, sorry?
I just realized that there's a lot of considerations in.
Yeah, a lot of considerations, right? And so this also leads to regulatory capacity disparities. Again, a common problem amongst developing nations. When you look at places like the US or the EU, there's overregulation in some places, right? You'll have multiple agencies looking at the same problem, and you'll have to be super careful. Sometimes you'll have the Securities and Exchange Commission getting involved with the same issue, the Federal Trade Commission getting involved, the Federal Consumer Protection Agency getting involved, same problem, right? In the Philippines, or at least in Pakistan, there might not be enough, right? You might have really limited regulatory capacities, and that's because you don't have the resources, you don't have the manpower, and you can't afford it, right? So the logistics are quite different in both places. Okay, so let's get to the pulp mills case. You have two countries, Uruguay and Argentina. And Uruguay approves construction of two pulp mills on the River Uruguay, which has a shared border with Argentina. And these two mills are run by foreign companies. One of them is Spanish and the other is Finnish. Now, Argentina objects and cites potential pollution impacts. In fact, there are a lot of protests across from the Argentina side, right? And so their dispute about how the being used, they have a treaty in place, right? They have a statute in place as to how this river should be managed between the two countries, but Argentina still goes ahead and has these pulp mills incorporated. So you have initial diplomatic negotiations failing. Argentina requests the ICJ to provide to have provisional measures. ICJ denies these provisional measures, and the CMB project, one of the projects gets abandoned, but the Orion project proceeds, right? And then the case gets heard in 2009, gets decided in 2010. You can actually see some of the protests that were going on around the time. So, people from Argentina saying that this project is illegal, right? And so they have these banners across the river. Okay, so my question to you guys, assuming that you read the case, is did Uruguay violate procedural obligations to provide prior notification, consult with Argentina, and conduct adequate environmental assessments? Yes, Senate.
According to the case, Prof, Uruguay violated procedural obligations because they did provide prior notifications, but not through the mechanism, not through CARU. And the notification was provided after the um giving authority already. So it
To the
wasn't,
project,
yeah,
right?
it
So
wasn't
see where I'm
really,
getting at? The IAA comes later sometimes?
yeah.
Okay.
So it wasn't really before. Also, the notification did not follow the EIA full blown requirement. They consulted with Argentina, but not through GATNA. So it's not also considered as really consultation. They conducted environmental assessment, but not as, not the standard, not consistent with the 1975 statute.
Okay. Good job. Does everyone agree with Zenith? Or is there anything else you'd like to add? It seems like Zenith is the only person who read the case. No? Okay, that's good. Okay. So, yeah. We've dealt with the procedural issues. Now let's get to the substantive issues. Did Uruguay violate substantive obligations to prevent pollution, preserve the aquatic environment in the river, and to ensure sustainable utilization of the river? V says no.
According to the case, Prof, there is no violation on the substantive obligations because there were enough processes made to Zenith's point, maybe not in accordance to the structure of the CARU, but there were enough studies and tests and even monitoring done. So no substantive violation.
Yes, Candy.
From what I can remember, from reading the 191-page case. um, I think the contentions of Argentina was not sufficiently provided with evidence. That is why the court said that there was no violation by Uruguay of its substantive obligations based on the 1975 statute.
Okay, good. I know these cases are long, right? But it really depends on your capacity as well. When it's one of those risks that you take on when you have a law program, right? Sometimes you'll have judgments that are super short. And then especially with a lot of international cases, you'll have really long judgments, and you'll see that those judgments are incredibly technical too, right? And especially with environmental judgments, super technical, super scientific, right? But then it also goes to show you how beautiful the whole system is, right? It's not just about the legal principles. It's also about what's happening on the ground and, how things are getting assessed. Okay. So in terms of the questions of evidence, where did the standard of proof lie? What was the standard of proof? And what was this role of scientific evidence when you were reading the case? And what were the methodologies that experts used when you read the case? Yes, KB.
Prof, just a guess. I think the level of evidence here must be clear and convincing.
Sorry?
Clear and convincing evidence.
Clear and convincing evidence. Okay. Yes, Candy.
From what I also can remember of the case, it said there that the standard of proof for environmental harm is expert scientific evidence.
Yes, Senate.
Oh, I forgot the standard of but the role of scientific evidence here is different from the other case that we discussed, Prof, because in the other case that we discussed, they relied on the experts. But in this case, the tribunal decided to check the data themselves, because the tribunal said that there are different interpretations of the scientific evidence and scientific data provided by the experts. The expert evaluation methodologies, there's one interesting um process that they did involving rotifers, or the small fishes, wherein they the in order to know if there's pollution in that area, they did a test before and after, and saw that there's no substantial link between the health of the small fishes, that can be linked to the pulp mills.
Good job. Yes, Suri.
Certainly it cannot be proof beyond the shadow of doubt. It must be lower than that.
Yeah,
But-
because it's not a criminal case, right?
That's right, ma'am. It's more of an
Balance of
is it-
probabilities.
pardon, ma'am,
The standard of proof must be balance of
Prepon-
probabilities.
or preponderance of evidence, because
Mhm.
in order for the petition or the case to proceed or to prosper, there must be evidence. And in fact, in this case, there appears to be no evidence that deleterious or effluents with deleterious effects had been flowing into the waters of the neighboring state. So there is no evidence, in fact, here.
Yes, Senate.
Oh yeah, Prof, I just remembered that there were two separate contentions and different contentions, but the tribunal ruled that whoever asserts a certain fact must be able to prove it, because there were contentions in the case wherein Argentina was saying that there is violation, but the burden of proof lies in them, and then they said no, it must be Uruguay who must prove otherwise, and then the court said no, you're the one who must prove it.
Because you're the one making the allegation, right? Okay. Yes, Nori.
Sometimes it's called allegata et probata. One who alleges must prove.
Must prove.
And
yes.
here, in this case, there is no evidence, in fact, by scientific process. Thank you.
Excellent. So if we look at the decision on procedural obligations, as Zenith pointed out, there were procedural irregularities. However, as far as substantive obligations were concerned, Argentina failed to prove that Uruguay had violated its pollution prevention obligations. And so there was, as you pointed out again, there was no evidence that the mill exceeded emission standards or harmed the river quality, right? And so, and regardless of that, the environmental monitoring should continue, but there was no finding that there was in fact any environmental damage, right? So the court found procedural violations, but allowed the mill to continue operating. You can actually see the mill in the background here, and you can see the protests happening. So no compensation was awarded to Argentina, and the parties were directed to cooperate through joint monitoring. And as far as I know, the mill is still operating to this day. Right? So when it comes to EIAs, what were the court's determinations? That, these requirements exist under general international law for industrial activities with significant transboundary risk. The content of the environmental impact assessment depends on the specific circumstances of the project. There is no specific methodology that's required under international law. And this is, by the way, one of the points of criticisms of EIAs, right? Like there's no standardization. It's like, like if this is, I mean, if you're interested in this as your capstone project, maybe you might want to explore this a little bit more. What should be the content of the EIA? How do you measure environmental impacts, harmoniously and consistently, right? Then EIAs must be conducted prior to project implementation, ideally. EIAs must assess alternative sites and technologies. The project must be monitored through operational life, right? Not just at the beginning, but throughout, and, even after the project has finished, you should continue monitoring what has happened. The case also recognized the importance of public consultation. They didn't really have much of a choice, considering if you look at the protest videos, there was a lot pictures, there was a lot going on the domestic front on the ground, right? But these consultation requirements depend on domestic laws and specific treaty obligations. This was the first case that recognized at the ICJ level that recognized environmental impact assessments as requirements under customary international law, and also established procedural and substantive distinctions in environmental obligations, and clarified the standard of proof for environmental harm, and emphasized the continuous monitoring requirement. But like I mentioned, it also had its limitations. There was no minimal guidance on specific EIA content, limited enforcement of procedural violations, and there was a high evidentiary standard for proving environmental harm. And there was too much deference to the states on the methodological questions involved in doing these environmental impact assessments. There has been other jurisprudence from the ICJ as well on environmental impact assessments, but didn't go, to the same extent that the pulp mills case did. This was a case between Australia and New Zealand versus France. When France was conducting nuclear tests. Luckily, France stopped, so the case didn't really go forward. Then we also have a transboundary, also a river dispute between Hungary and Slovakia. And, they had a treaty in place, but, and Slovakia decided to build a barrage, if I remember correctly. And, there was a recognition that if you have a treaty about like the use of transboundary waters, you can actually put environmental interpretations into that treaty, even if it's not explicitly over there. Yeah. So another case was about Costa Rica versus Nicaragua, had to do with the management of wetlands, right? And cross-boundary projects. This is like some of the wetlands looks somewhat similar to the Philippines in a way, right? So yeah, a lot of different cases, and increasingly we see that states are under a lot of due diligence requirements, and this means that for business as well, if a state is under due diligence requirement, that can trickle down to you as a company that is operating within certain states, right? And you have like different frameworks for this. So for example, you have the European Union EIA framework, and this really depends on the type of project involved. So if you have Annex 1 projects, which are large scale projects including major roads, airports, large power stations, oil refineries, large waste facilities, then they're required mandatorily to have an environmental impact assessment in place. If it is a smaller project, but could have potential environmental impact, such as, urban development, small dams, agriculture, smaller projects, there could be a screening process for whether there should be an environmental impact assessment depending on the nature of the project, right? So it's not mandatory, but they will look at the project as a whole and see, okay, could this have any environmental impact or not? So they're increasingly, even in the EU, the standards are evolving. You have increased biodiversity considerations, increased climate change considerations. Also when you're, not just having the environmental impact assessment in place, how are you utilizing the resources you're using to actually build these projects? That is also there. and then disaster risk prevention, which, by the way, is increasingly becoming a part of the Philippines framework as well, right? If you have, the Philippines has its own disaster risk management framework that you need to have in place. Okay. With the United States, like I mentioned, the Council on Environmental Quality regulations, and then sometimes you can have agency-specific implementation rules depending on which agency is, if it's agriculture, food, depending on, what their supply chain practices are. And then in some cases, you will have like, NEPA will have their own processes in place. So, if it's found that a project does not have any environmental impact, then this will come under the CX category, right? You don't need to take any action on this. If there's uncertain impact, then you will have an environmental impact assessment. And then if not, then you'll have what is called a FONSI, which is like something like a first, I've forgotten what it is, but it's a notification requirement, right? And then if it's a major action, then you have the environmental impact statement that needs to be done. Okay. So other countries are also following suit. China also has an expanding EIA system in place now. It's the same with Brazil, India too. Different African countries also have this in place. And also I know at least in Pakistan, not on the government level, but at least at the company level, as directors, you can definitely get penalized for not looking at the environmental impact of your projects. In terms of international standards and best practices, we have the UNEP goals and principles. And so I have your on the screen what these UNEP goals are about, right? Why are you having the EIA there in the first place, right? First, to render detail on the environmental impact, to identify legitimate options and mitigation measures, predict and evaluate ecological, economic, and social effects of growth-related activities, right? So it's really comprehensive when you're doing this EIA, and to promote environment-friendly and long-term growth, right? So balancing both the environment and the economy. Okay. Then you have the IAA best practice principles. I've forgotten what IAA stands for. I'll get to that in a bit. And then the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, the ISO 1400 environmental management systems, right? These are just standards that you need to have in place, or you can have in place if you want to show that you're being compliant, want to operate internationally. Right, so best practices include early integration in project planning, clear methodological transparency, have a robust alternatives analysis, have meaningful stakeholder engagement, have independent audits, independent review mechanisms, and don't be stubborn, right? If you realize you're making a mistake, stop right there. That was a point that I was trying to get across initially. And based on the reactions I got, it seems like that's not something most people want to admit. A project is failing, it's not going to work out, but it's all about my ego. I have to be right, and I have to be a know-it-all. So I'm actually going to continue with this self-destruction, company destructive project, right? Okay, so you really need to be adaptive, right? So that's also why I spoke about mindfulness last time, why I'm talking about risk management right now, right? If if you can see something is going to be off, leave your ego aside as a management, like, you know, as an executive, as somebody who's leading some projects, and, you know, okay. And then integrate your project with broader sustainability assessments. There are other frameworks in place. We will, this week, I'll talk about some of them, but we're going to get into the nitty gritties of these different sustainability standards in the makeup class that we have on Tuesday, Wednesday. Yes, Joaquin.
Regarding on the stakeholder engagement or the public consultation side, what mechanism should we use? Should we use a survey form? Because in our practice here in the province, what we did is like we conduct a public hearing, we just get the attendance and just hear them out. After that, the decision will came from the legislators, whether they like it or not. It's up to the legislators. So with
Right.
regard to the
So in your like in your experience, has this form of public consultation been effective, or would you say that it's been quite ineffective?
it became compliance. It's just for compliance only, for compliance purposes. So technically it's ineffective because the decision making will matter on the legislators. So when if the company bribe the legislators, so the decision would be favorable to the company.
Okay, so that's a really good question. Let's take this as a case study. What would you recommend to Joaquin in this particular scenario? How would you come up? What would be a, you know, an effective way to have public consultation? Yes, G.
I wanted to point that out earlier. Just giving an example. In the CREATE law, it's a business tax law. Uh, when that was before it was signed, there were industries in our field, and they're getting representations from each company as part of the industry, and then we look at the draft. And then okay, you give some, you get some, you don't get everything. They're looking at it, the legislators, but some, they hear some of the insights, so that's signed into law. And then after that, a public consultation happens through going through they set up the venue, and then there's Zoom even for the public companies. And then there were a lot of I think the legislation has to hear it from the companies, because that's groundwork. That's what's really happening in the business. And a lot of those were considered. Of course, there were a lot that were not, but that's why we always say there was the CREATE law, and now there is the CREATE more. We are expecting CREATE most. But yes, it's been effective for us, because it's not really hearing everything in the public one by one. It was through industries and organization that we can
And like
effectively
what I hear is also there was really very specific stakeholder consultation. I mean, companies don't really represent the public at large, right?
yeah
In a way too.
It was very DTI or industry specific.
Right,
for-
right. Yes, Dodi.
My suggestion to Joaquin would be to campaign against those legislators who do not listen. They have to elect, especially now in 2 weeks, they will be electing. So there's time to campaign against them and elect champions of sustainability in the council. I think
Okay.
you will agree.
So I mean, would you say the problem is at the notification stage, or is it actually at the consultation stage, or is it like post consultation? If you had to, if I mean, I can see, Joaquin, that you think that there's a problem, but where do you think the problem actually lies?
The problem lies in there's no enabling law, or there's no specific law what determines public consultation is. So it becomes a compliance, like attendance is already necessary that there's a public hearing. but nevertheless, it's a gray area. So if legislator would interpret it, that's just only a requirement, not not in a form of of public consultation, but as just a form of requirement.
Okay, so how would you improve this? It's a question for everybody. How would you improve this? Zenith.
Possibly codifying, I mean, being responsive to Joaquin's problem or the problem mentioned by Joaquin. It is to codify what public consultation is, because there are different interpretations of what public consultation is, and it's nuanced normally on the practice or the culture of an agency.
Okay, so if you were coming up with a legislation around public consultation in the Philippines, how would you go about, what would be the key points that you would like to address? And what would you write in it?
To identify the real stakeholders and to actually convene with them. So first, I think one of the problems would be the agencies do not know who the real stakeholders are, because they're just being given the bill without actually knowing the contents of it. And then once they identify the stakeholders still don't know who the focals in their office are. So it's a systematic change. I think it has to come from the agency conducting the public consultation, but the change also has to come from other agencies to be informed of the process.
Yes, Judy, and then G.
Shouldn't the LGUs be involved in that setting for it?
Local government units?
Yeah, local
Okay.
especially nowadays, it's election season. So I see the word caucus. Is it caucus? Being used more often. If it's sort of like that for me, right? That's already a public consultation, but there's formality because there's an
So
LG.
how would you tie that into election season?
The election season becomes a driver in terms of timing, right? And it's also a driver in terms of setting the expectation,
So in terms of
establishing
time,
clarity.
like people start acting more efficiently?
Yes,
Okay.
and there would be growing demand because
I mean, I don't know about the Philippines, but at least the Elections Act in Pakistan specifically states that if there's, you know, a person who's running for the National Assembly or even the provincial assembly, and they're heading, you know, some sort of and this, by the way, trickles down to government agencies as well. They actually cannot um, start major projects in the year before the election. Yeah. So, I mean, it becomes a major problem. Like when I was involved in, when I was working for a BNR, which is one of Pakistan's major corporate and commercial and constitutional litigation firm, we had cases where the gas pipeline authority had just wanted to procure some gas pipelines for fixing a few issues, and they were concerned that they would, you know, come within the ambit of the Elections Act, and were concerned about compliance. And so the question was, is this politically motivated? Is this a new project? Is this minor repairs? So on and so forth. So I mean, I don't know about compliance in the Philippines, but mostly countries will have some sort of regulation around what is allowed in the election year or not. Now, coming back to public consultations, Joaquin made a, you know, he asked, should you have like some sort of a questionnaire? Zenith is like, no, I'm not too sure about this questionnaire thing. Why not, Zenith?
I used to handle the legal and legislative affairs of the office. So there are pending bills in our office, and what I've observed is that the questions that you ask the stakeholders during the stakeholders meeting in one bill is different from the other. They're different from the other. So there's no really hard and fast rule on drafting the questions. It's more of knowing the nuances of what you really want to get from it.
Okay, so we're still left back at square one. How do you have effective public consultation? G and then Mir.
I would pattern it to how it was done to the law I was referring to earlier. There should be like legit groups. So in our case, if it's tax business, IBPAP is the group in consultation with PEZA. So IBPAP is an organization. So whatever law that or project they wanted to pass, what are the recognized groups who has the credibility and the voice to get representation from each stakeholder, relevant stakeholder, because they will filter it out, and they have the credibility to really assess the project or the law, and not just a mere noise. So to me, that will have a filtering system, and the political aspect is very important because it will be positioned as how many employees or how many people are concerned, which could be translated to voters, and they lobby, go to supporting senators, supporting the bill to get that support also. Okay, this is 2 million employees in their families and indirect employees. It could translate to 10 million people impacted. So, it won't put anyone down, but it gives the supporters, senator in our case, that edge for the upcoming elections.
Okay. Yes, Mir, what do you think about G's solution?
First, I put myself in the shoes of the public. In this case, I am the public. I'm the one you want to consult, correct? All right. So if I'm the one that you are asking, Joaquin, tell me the objective first. What is it that you want to know or consult from me? Then make me care about it. Do I even care about whatever it is that you are asking me? What is this about? Second, how does this impact me? If you already got me to care, what is the impact on me? This is not about law or elections or something. This is about the common tao or me, the public. And then if you're able to successfully communicate what you want or frame the question in a way that I would be able to understand, you give me time to think. So you have to campaign it so that a lot of people will respond to you. Because I heard about what you said, this is really more of compliance. If you are already able to make me understand, campaign it, you should be able to gather enough number of respondents. You have to, Professor, sorry, you have to aim for, I don't know, a certain number. How many respondents are you intending to reach for you to determine whether your public consultation is effective or not? So you should be able to measure it. Now, with regards to the survey questions, I think the intention of the survey questions is just to simplify it so that there will not be too much nuances. You will be able to frame the questions in a manner wherein the public can just respond, let's say a yes or a no, or so that it will be easy to measure. So that's my answer to the question.
Okay, KB and then Andre, and then we're going to end the session.
Hi, Prof. I agree with Mir and G, and I think it would be best to put the results of the public consultation in the recitals or whereas clauses in the local ordinance, so that the public would also know why did they come up with this kind of ordinance or guidelines? Why did the legislators decide? Because this was the public's opinion, and it's included in the first page of the ordinance or the guidelines. It would also avoid tailor fitting the guidelines, and especially this is very relevant to public procurement. It would also respect declaring this kind of information in the recitals would also allow transparency in the government.
Good afternoon, Professor. My answer would be a modification of what KB said. So it's more of publishing the result of the consultation, regardless of on whether or not it became an ordinance or a resolution, but making the result of the consultation available, documenting everything, how the consultation transpired, and making the committee, the body, the politicians involved in the consultation liable or accountable. Um, because if whe- if they proceed to take action, maybe say make an ordinance against what was the consensus during the consultation, then at least that it could be proved or it could be shown that they went against it, or if they support the consultation, then they went with it. So something like that.
Okay, excellent.
Just in connection with the statement of my teammate. Ma'am, in some council, they try to have a televised consultation proceedings so that the people know whether or not the politicians really listen. Politicians' motive is votes, not money. Unlike businessmen, they want money. But politicians, they want the votes of people. So they can be controlled by their behavior could be controlled by having them shown on TV.
Yeah, I mean, and you'll see this in the United States, like at the local level, every hearing that happens that's supposed to be a public hearing gets televised. And you'll find, I mean, it's one of those things, if you go down the YouTube rabbit hole, you'll find these videos with 0 views where, these guys are like sort of bowing to the American flag. It's just like 2 guys or 1 guy, and he's standing in a room by himself. And, they're like, it's supposed to be a public area and nobody shows up for them. Yeah, yeah. And there's also like, I mean, they're quite common in the UK. So you have like these local council hearings. And there was like this one video that happened in the UK, like during the pandemic, where this local council meeting got viral because there was, yeah, it was an online thing. Yeah, you can search it on YouTube. I've forgotten which council it was, but like there was like this entire council that was against like this one lady called Jackie or something. And like it was just like an orchestrated coup against her. And like there's all these like old people in it. And then it became viral. And then you had like random people from the UK dressed up in a weird costume showing up to those meetings. But the whole point was that people realize that these council meetings can be quite important. So maybe I don't know, Joaquin, maybe you need to have better advertisements around why people should care. Like maybe have memes involved. I mean, I've seen this happening in Uzbekistan where, the anti-monopoly committee over there, it's not as populated as the Philippines, nowhere near as populated as Pakistan. The competition concerns are really simple, and it's like this is what happened at the weekend market. Like that's it, basically. But what they've done is they'll add like really funny memes around each case. So, like, if you go to a random Uzbek government agency website, you'll find Nicolas Cage memes. You'll find all sorts of, yeah. Like, I mean, I think, Joaquin, maybe that's the way people should go about it. Just make it more creative, have people show up, make them care, and then, like, if they care enough, because from what I see, this is also a trust problem, right? Yeah. Like it's a trust, and trust really centers around communication. Okay, so I mean, I just wanted to add, I got caught by surprise when Derek was talking about the IFC standards, but yeah, just going back to this, the IFC performance standards are, sometimes if you want, like you have PhilXM, which is the export credit agency here in the Philippines, right? Like if you have these standards in place, you can actually get some export credit as well. So the IFC standard is good for that. Also, like, if you can have, you can use them towards getting equity from banks, so on and so forth, right? So it's just good to like have them to look good, have a good credit rating. So I hope that answers your question, Derek, about what those standards do. I'm sorry if I forgot about this. This is my, I've been working since early morning. So I had to attend a seminar till 1 a.m. last night. So I apologize. I keep on forgetting things. But anyway, I will see you all in around 20 minutes. Okay, everyone, can we start? Okay. What do I have in my hand? A pencil. Okay. Any guesses as to where this pencil could be made? Sorry? Obviously, no idea. Sorry? Well, where could this pencil have come from? What is it made from? Where has this pencil come from? What if I look at this pencil, right? What does it have? What it it's a safe guess, made in China. Okay. Sure. Is every component of this pencil made in China? No. Okay. It came from a tree. So the outer shell came from a tree, right? There's a wooden part of this, came from some tree somewhere, right? What I need to write, it has something for it, right? What's the thing here? Lead. Okay. Where does the lead come from?
From the mining company.
From the mining company. Okay, how do I know which mining company and where could a mining company be placed? Like if I,
Surigao, Philippines.
from the Philippines?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there a lead mining company over there?
Yeah, it's a Chinese mining company called New Sky.
And they manufacture, like they mine graphite.
Not specifically, it's a raw material, and they bring it to China and then to Germany.
Germany. Good. Okay. So somebody knows something about the supply chain of pencils here. Okay. Right. Then I have in this pencil an eraser. What is the eraser made of? Rubber. Where's the rubber coming from? From the rubber tree? Okay, that's a simple answer. But where could the rubber tree be most likely?
Uh, the raw material comes from a rubber tree in Zamboanga and Cotabato. And they have the raw material there. But
So they have rubber trees in
I
Zamboanga.
don't know the detail of the supply chain, if it's a foreign
Right.
company or intervenes on the manufacturing.
Mostly it's, you know, I didn't know about Zamboanga. That's good to know. But mostly the rubber comes from Indonesia. Near enough? Okay. They all, well, I mean, I'm talking about supply chains. So we know that there's a rubber tree, right? So there's more than one tree involved in making this pencil. But what I'm trying to get at is, so we have also graphite in this, and I did not know that there were graphite mines here in the Philippines, but normally they'll come from the graphite will come from as far away as Zanzibar in Africa, right? So how do I know where these minerals are coming from? There's actually a website called Mindat. This is going to be super useful for you when you guys finally study international trade. But yeah, Mindat. But what am I trying to get at is that manufacturing something as simple as, oh, I raised it. As a pencil can be a complicated process, right? And so you have the raw materials, the production, the marketing, right? Which includes the sale, the transportation, so on and so forth, right? And so when you look at a supply chain, how do you know what is going on at each component of supply chain, right? And like, if I look at each part of the supply chain, whether it's the graphite that's getting mined, there's the pencil, like the wood that is getting deforested, right? The rubber that's been taken from Zamboanga or from Indonesia, or whatever it is, right? We know that each part of that supply chain has some process, and that process has some regulation behind it, right? And increasingly, companies are being subjected to these regulations depending on where these companies are registered and where these companies are also doing their their production and their marketing, right? So when it comes to sustainable supply chains, we really have to look at the entire process of where something is happening. So what I'm trying to say is it's not simple, right? And so where do you start?
The figures does not have a beginning. So if that says something, then it could start from any of those. Is that the question, ma'am?
Sure. So you're saying that we can even start if we really want to be compliant, not just compliant, but be sustainable, which is a lot more than the compliance tick mark. We can just start anywhere in this supply chain.
The figure suggests that.
Well, I mean, my figure could be wrong, right?
Okay, all right.
Maybe I just added this because it seemed like a nice graphic. Yes, Zenith. I mean, it's completely okay to disagree with me. Okay, yeah.
All right, ma'am.
Just like in procurement, Prof, supply chain starts in planning and knowing what exactly is needed by the organization and the demands accordingly.
Yes, Judy.
Ma'am, I'll recite now because I cannot recite for the shell case. I think
I feel like I'm a dictator that's making you guys, I didn't know this was a thing with the Philippines law schools. I'm sorry. You don't have to feel like, okay,
Oh no,
let's,
because our corporal team and legal team told me I cannot talk about the case. So I'll recite now because I cannot recite later.
oh,
Yes, ma'am.
you're from Shell.
But
Oh
ma'am,
no.
I did share insights with the LT teams and shared resources, but I cannot recite. But this one I'll answer.
So you can only talk to the team, but not to me.
I can only talk about things that are within my remit. But
Ah.
as a way of helping the team,
But you
I
know
shared
where
the
my mind is
research.
going, like now I know this is exactly the person I want to grill during this.
But I did share
You've
research.
exposed yourself in the process. I wouldn't have known that you worked for Shell otherwise. Okay, but anyway, let's hear what you have to say.
For this one, I think based on practice, and if I base it on the legal requirements in the Philippines right now, like the EPR law, and jumping off from what Sir Dodi said about we can start anywhere from the circular model. My main starting point, I guess, would be waste management. So planning how we deal with waste and working backwards across the chain that touches on everything. And at the same time, complying with the Extended Producers Act, Responsibility Act.
Good job.
Yes.
Right? So we have, at least in this sense, the Philippines, when we talk about sustainable supply chains and production, we have at least something that's related to a particular type of waste, which is plastics, right? So it's not like the Philippines doesn't have nothing. It does have something, but it's very, very particular, right? So if let's take that and let's take Shell as a case study on plastics. How how would you start with waste?
Well, first, this is in practice already. We started with educating sustainability focal points about the basics of EPR. And we also started very early so that we can be in dialogue with the government and we can gather questions, gather challenges from the ground, from various representatives from the supply chain, and we can bring those back to the government leaders as we co-shape how we can implement the regulation. That's how we started.
Okay. So just to give you a heads up, once I get the case study questions, I do have some slides on what Shell did, and you are happy. I'd be happy if you can confirm or deny any of those things, that we talk about. So it's always excellent to have that sort of expert knowledge in place. So I mean, I don't want to get you in trouble, but I do want your input because I'm like we have Ingrid Barona from Gcash who has a really senior level position, and she's in the MIBL 2025 cohort. And just like when I've been teaching cybersecurity, she's actually been an excellent resource. I mean, at least in her case, she was open about how they've dealt with situations. And in their case, they're actually super proud of what they've done, right? So, I mean, like, it's also a great resource for the class to have people from the inside of the industry. And that's the whole point of this program, not just having lawyers, right? But actually having industries, people who know how things work on the ground. Okay, so broadly speaking, we're going to look at some of the legal frameworks that govern sustainable supply chains across various jurisdictions, not just the Philippines, but in other places as well. And then we'll also look at some landmark cases that have shaped corporate ESG compliance requirements, and then we'll look at the Shell case study, and then also identify emerging trends in mandatory ESG reporting and due diligence legislation. So, in simple terms, when we look at sustainable supply chain governance, I've mentioned this in the past, most of these CSR and ESG initiatives, especially CSR really, just started off as a marketing tool, right? The companies that were promoting it, and like I said, even the first Harvard Business CSR programs were actually, put in place by these major oil corporations, a lot of big companies. There are programs at Harvard that are actually funded by Lockheed Martin, the weapons company, right? So they, the whole point is that they want to look good, right? So, and this is where CSR initiatives initially start. Like, they want people to not think that they are these negative things. And the reason for this is that major corporations like IBM actually had a huge role to play with the Nazi regime in Germany. So it became quite well known that, even Coca-Cola was involved in this. Fanta has its roots, which is now, marketed as Royale here in the Philippines, actually was created in Nazi Germany, right? Like IBM was actually involved in collecting information about people in Nazi Germany. So there was like and then you had these like huge companies like Standard Oil in the United States in the late 1800s, which monopolize entire regions, right, in the US. And what this leads to is cartels, high prices for consumers, right? And so post Second World War, it becomes quite obvious to people. And this is also where antitrust law develops, right? Like, a lot of competition commissions come in. They say, these big companies have to be broken up. There needs to be more compliance. There needs to be more scrutiny. And so the companies, as this marketing initiative, start these voluntary corporate codes of conduct. They're saying, you know what? We're not those bad guys. We're not like those guys who caused, the Holocaust. We're not like the bad guys who caused people the Great Depression and so on and so forth, right? And so that's where it starts, right? However, at the same time, you have, even though you have these so-called voluntary codes, that still doesn't mean that these corporations are behaving ethically. So you have incidents like the Union Carbide disaster in Bhopal in India. Has anyone ever heard about that? Okay, so there's a gas leakage at a factory in Bhopal in India, and hundreds of workers die. Yeah, it's the pesticide plants, right? And the reason these workers die is that there are no safety procedures in place for the workers. The building has not been built properly, and it has wide-reaching societal impacts. Then later on in the 2000s, you have again in South Asia, the Rana Plaza incident. Has anyone heard about that? Okay, so Rana Plaza, we know that a lot of cloth manufacturing happens in Bangladesh, right? And there are major Canadian brands, like there's, if you go to Canada, it's a really well-known brand, Joe Fresh. They sell T-shirts, women's clothing, men clothing, supposed to be really affordable, right? But if you look at their supply chain, the clothing is coming from Bangladesh, where people are getting paid peanuts, and the buildings that these workers are operating in don't have a safe exit, don't have safe exits, don't have safe emergency exits, don't have any fire controls in place. The workers don't even have fire drills happening. And so there's a fire in this factory, and guess what? Hundreds of workers die, right? So you also have, again, Canadian companies, such as Barrick Gold, acting in Africa, right? Mining companies. And what they're doing is bribing local policemen and not giving fair wages. The locals are complaining about how they're not benefiting from this mine. They're being exploited. And what does Barrick Gold do in collaboration with the police? They decide to burn down the entire village. Right? So you have these incidents happening across different supply chains. And so it becomes more and more obvious with time that these companies, especially multinationals, should be held accountable. Right? And so with this, you have the proliferation of industry-wide standards, certification schemes. You also have increasingly more disclosure-focused legislation, especially in the EU. I've already talked about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that the US had in place already, right? But the EU was a bit behind. And the UK especially was super behind. You have entire economies collapsing, such as the economy of Mozambique, because the bank Credit Suisse decided to bribe local officials. And these are projects that are related to the development of ports. And because there is corruption involved with these banks pushing these products across, to locals, economies that would have been emerging otherwise just completely collapse and never recover from it, right? So you have increasing disclosure related legislation for banks, for financial institutions, for all sorts of companies, right? And so that leads us to now what are called mandatory due diligence requirements at the EU level, in Canada, in France and Germany, is specifically these countries as well, when we're going to look at that. And then the US as well, but the US is a bit of a circus right now. They actually rolled back on a lot of things. They implemented a lot of things, and then they rolled back, and then they said, we don't really want them back anyway. We're just okay with making profit. Okay, so that's where we're at in terms of where the legislation is standing, and we're going to get into greater details. Now, when we look at a supply chain, we look at not just the environmental dimensions, but also the social and governance dimensions, right? So if we look at the environmental dimensions, we look at carbon footprints, resource efficiencies. Are the products we're manufacturing recyclable? Can we create a circular economy behind this? What about the impact to biodiversity where we're operating, our plants? And what about can we create processes which don't produce as much waste? What are our labor rights and working conditions? What about the impacts on the communities that we're operating in? What about, are we involved in colonial settlerism? Right? And there are historical precedents for this, at least in the subcontinent. The way that the British government entered the subcontinent was through the East India Company, the British East India Company, right? and all had to do with trading. What did the any idea as to what the British East India Company traded? Spices. What type of spices?
Pepper, ma'am. Sorry.
Cinnamon,
Cin-
star anise, cloves, right? And what's surprising is that, you know, the British killed so many people for this, but they have the blandest food in the world. What if I told you that was strategic? It just had to do with British snobbery, right? Why? Because the more the East India Company, they also traded in tea, by the way, right? So the more the British East India Company gets their hands on these spice islands and, you know, like goes, you know, colonizes places in India, or, you know, even goes to China, what happens is these spices start becoming really common in the UK, right? And so everybody has these spices now. And then the rich are like, you know what? We don't want to be like these commoners who use all these spices. We're going to have food that tastes like its original taste. So there are actually articles about how the blandness of British food has to do with their actual snobbery, right? So anyway, talking about colonialism, the social dimension of sustainable supply chains also has to do with land rights, land use, land development, right? So you can also see the land use authority here in the Philippines getting involved in this. And then obviously health and safety, not just of the end consumer, but also of the workers who are involved in the supply chain. In terms of governance, and then we'll get into this when we talk about, especially next week, sustainability reporting, and you know, how transparent are those sustainability reports. There's a reading on how to read sustainability reports from the University of Calgary, which is a part of your readings. I highly recommend that you go through it prior to coming to the lecture. You'll really enjoy it. Okay, then and you'll also start seeing that, you know, numbers can lie. You know, numbers are not as transparent as they seem, especially when you start going through these reports. Now, then, of course, how ethical are you being? Are you involved in bribery, fraud, money laundering? Something that, you know, the Philippines has dealt with, especially just getting out of the fat of gray list. By the way, so has Pakistan. We got out of it a bit, you know, a little bit before you guys, 2 years before you guys, but we were definitely there, right? So for you guys, I think it was the gambling stuff. For us, it was like supposedly terrorism. But anyway, so then you have how, like, are you being anti-competitive? Are you driving businesses out of their business, right? Are you monopolizing? Are you paying your taxes responsibly? Or like Starbucks, are you actually involved in paying your taxes, right? Are you using political influence to be operating where you are? So recently, and you know, we have people from China here, so maybe they can tell us about whether this is true or not. But if you listen to a lot of compliance podcasts, especially the last, like maybe 3 or 4 years ago, there would be a lot of concerns about these like US companies going to China, and talking to Chinese officials, and then coming up with these like conferences about, that would take place in the US. And those conferences would actually take place in Vegas, right? And it would, you know, like the whole point was to actually get like government contracts, procurements, and then it would turn out that these, you know, conferences were actually not happening. And so there were compliance issues with this, right? So how do you make sure that people are actually attending conferences, are not going to casinos or doing other things in Vegas? What do you do then? If there's a real conference, how do you establish that? Certificate of attendance?
Yes, Prof. And there's also, we require a report, ano yun, parang echo, post report, and that they required to echo what they have learned in the seminar or the conference.
Yes, you can have some reflection activity. I mean, these days even the AI can do that, right? But like you know, the simple answer is you can have wet signatures, right? And so like you'll see this with a lot of conferences. Before you enter the conference hall, they'll actually ask you to sign, right? So really simple procedures in place. Now, I'm not singling out the Chinese here, by the way. I mean, if you ask me, Pakistan, we're like, the things that happen are at a comical level. Yeah. But I mean, it's just, I think that sometimes when one country doesn't like another, even the podcasts tend to be like focusing on how bad the other country is. So I'm sure the Chinese have a lot of things to say about US officials, and we all know that they can be bullies, right? We've seen this, and we're seeing it right now. So anyway, getting back to sustainable supply chains, right? So you have to look at all of these different things when you are trying to see whether you really have a sustainable supply chain or not. Now, the accountability system can include not just state-based mechanisms, but also market-based tools and civil society actions, right? So you can have not just legislations and international treaties and judicial enforcement, but you can also have certification schemes and standards at the market level. And as we'll see with, you know, Shell and other companies, you can have investor pressures, you can have ESG ratings, right? S&P ratings, so on and so forth. You can have consumer activism and boycotts. People who say, we are not going to buy Nestle, for example, because Nestle is not being the most sustainable of companies. And we've actually seen this in practice, right? And then you can also have industry standards, right? Industry best practices, industry associations saying, you know what, if you want our certifications, this is what you need to comply with this. You know, we are going to self-regulate. And if you want to be a part of our club, this is what you have to, these are our best practices, and this is how you need to act, right? So peer pressure can also have a role in this. Now, civil society, obviously NGOs, strategic class action litigation, and also media exposés about what companies are doing, in this case, Shell. So, right. And in terms of looking at the more state-based mechanisms, these are of different types as well. So you have hard laws, which are binding legal requirements and specific compliance obligations. But you also can have, and this is what the SEC in the US will do a lot, the Department of Justice will do a lot. They will have guidelines for you, right? You can actually call them up and ask them, so we're going to implement this program, this project. We want to be compliant, and we want you to get involved, right? And they will actually come and assist you and come up with, look at the various models you've come up with and actually try to help you out with this. Then, obviously, voluntary commitments, industry best practices. We've seen this with the extractive industry, case studies that I showed you last week. And then self-regulation and reporting, this is controversial, right? There's an entire debate within law whether companies can self-regulate or should our market-based mechanisms effective, because there's an entire field of literature on law and economics where you have basically the Chicago school saying you should not regulate companies, just let them be. And the market will regulate the companies. If a company is inefficient,
Is it akin to laissez-faire? No.
uh, not exactly this. Like, I mean, yes and no. It's derived from that, but in this case, what they're saying is it's more. They look at it more of like a game theory problem, right? So they're saying, okay, if the corporation is behaving in a certain way, then there are necessarily some sort of social cost to this, to the behavior, and so people will, consumers and investors will start behaving in a certain way if they find out that you're unethical, and so the market will force the corporation to self-regulate, right? So there's an entire field of literature behind this. And what it actually reminds me of is I was presenting my work at the Institute for Global Law and Policy at Harvard Law School in 2018. And they had this is like one of the major law conferences. If you've presented at IGLP, at least in legal academia, you've technically made it, right? So there was this lady, and it was so funny because I was talking about in a very different panel about Islamic finance and corporate regulations, and there was this lady who was, I believe she was Chinese, and she was talking about the Buddhist approach to corporate law. And so in Buddhism, the idea is that if you want to attain perfection or nirvana or whatever it is that's the ideal, you have to be free from outside forces, outside influences. And so she said that since the corporation is also a person, in order for the corporation to attain self-fulfillment, it needs to be free from outside regulation. Yeah, this was actually going on at Harvard Law School. And I don't think that this is what Buddhism is about, right? Because in essence, I think she missed the point, because what is happening behind this is actually what is driving a lot of corporate action is just greed, right? Which is the exact opposite of what Buddhism is about. And so, even for me, at that time, I didn't think about it because my paper actually happened to be about how Islamic law is so heavy on regulation, right? Everything about your life, but it also, for us, where you reach that stage of, unity or perfection, or what we call ihsan, is, it really you really reach that through actually following not just the letter, but also the spirit of the law, right? So, it was just really interesting for me to see this, but it's a really strange application of the law and economics movements to Buddhism. So yeah, but yes, that paper was accepted at Harvard. I was as shocked and feel like it was the right place to talk about it. It's just one of those things where it's more like hindsight is 2020. I was quite frankly, I was also a junior researcher and I had imposter syndrome. And I was just super excited to be at Harvard and be talking at the podium, right? So So, I mean, in hindsight, and I told this to, what's interesting is I actually got, and, the conference was super useful for me in the long term because I got introduced to Nadia Ahmed, who is going to be your resource speaker. And she teaches environmental law at Yale, right? So I told her, and like, even it stood out to her as well, like she just thought it was really interesting. But yeah, it is what it is.
Is it in a journal? A journal.
I don't know. I did not follow up on it. But I mean, I'm sure you can, if you search for Buddhism and corporations and, external impacts, maybe, regulations, maybe you'll be able to find this paper because it's such a unique concept, right? But I mean, I guess the shock factor of it is what got it sold over there. Anyway, right. So let's get back to this. There's increasing, especially since the 2008 financial crisis, there is increasing scrutiny, right? So in short, the US did follow the law and economics approach to this, the Chicago approach to maybe leaving the corporations a bit loose, letting the market work. But then it was realized post the 2008 financial crisis that maybe that is not the best way to go about things. Now, in terms of hybrid approaches, you have something which is really prevalent in the UK, which is the comply or explain approach. I think it's there in Germany as well, but the UK really is like one of the flag bearers of this approach, which is that, okay, if you are a publicly listed company, you have to, these are the regulations. This is what you need to comply with. And if you do not comply with this, you will have to publicly explain your actions. So it's not exactly hard law, but it's not soft law either, right? At the same time, it doesn't really have penalties as well attached to it, but it's just there. Like it has its its drawbacks. Just because explaining something doesn't mean that you are going to change your course of behavior, right? So a lot of times when the corporations decide to explain things, they're also doing a cost and benefit analysis, right? In some cases, even if they get penalized by fines, the benefit of continuing to do business as usual is a lot more. And so they will continue to do business as they were. But what you'll also have in the UK are what are called deferred prosecution agreements. Has anyone ever heard of them? Okay, so a deferred prosecution agreement is basically where there will be some sort of penalty. But if you, as a company, find out that, at the lower level, in this case, let's say Mozambique, just because that's the country that's coming off at the top of my head, right? You find out that one of your employees is engaged in bribery over there, right? And you're diligent enough to tell the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, or maybe even in the US, you explain to the Department of Justice or the SEC that we have found something within our organization which could lead to potential harm for us. We want you to know first, right? So, and we don't know the extent of the harm and so on and so forth, right? You decide to be the person who admits we've done something wrong. In those cases, the concerned authority will actually say, you know what, we plan on prosecuting you, but it's not going to happen right now. We're going to defer that prosecution. And because you're a good person, we will reduce the penalties that you might face. Right? So if you're maybe going to be liable for $300 million, maybe now it's just 50 million. Right? So broadly speaking, this is what you'll have going on over there. So this is what the second point is about: mandatory reporting with flexible implementation. Right? So deferred prosecution agreements. And then you can have, and this is also the case, so the Philippines also has its own sustainability standards board. And so you can actually, have your company endorsed by them. Okay, so if we look at the international realm, moving from the local to the international, we have the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. We also have the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, which we've covered in the past. These are all soft law instruments. We also have the OECD due diligence guidance for minerals, which, by the way, has been implemented in the US via the Dodd-Frank Act and also in the EU. So they're like in compliance with this. And I'll get to that in a bit. Then we also have the International Labour Organization, which, by the way, was the first international organization to ever exist. It has its own declarations and conventions, such as the Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, the Tripartite Declaration on Multinational Enterprises, right? It provides guidance to governments, employers, and workers' organizations, multinational enterprises, and other national enterprises in the areas of employment, training, conditions of work, so on and so forth. At the same time, you have what are called pressure groups, right? So you have these international amalgamated unions, such as the United Steelworkers, which I was involved with briefly when I was in Canada, one of the largest amalgamated unions. It sounds super tough, but I was a part of it because I was working at the University of Toronto Law Library. So nothing to do with actual steelwork. But it gave me the opportunity to visit their headquarters in Pittsburgh for what they have. They have like this International Women of Steel conference every year. And it's really interesting because there are people from the UN, people from the ILO that are there. And then you meet these women who are working in potash alum mines, like 4,000 feet underground, nickel mines, 5,000 feet underground. Like amazing, just the type of people and exposure that you see. And funnily enough, when I was involved with the Ontario Bar Association, I found out that the ILO also regulates international soldiers. So if you are in the military and you've been posted abroad, guess what? The ILO is there to help you, unless you're involved in like raping people and, all sorts of human rights abuses. That's when the United Steelworkers will come in and actually try to get you. So, these international unions are also, they also have like what are called super PACs or political action committees. They're huge lobby groups, can be super organized as well. Okay, so from soft law, we get to hard law, right? So, and that is what is happening increasingly. We have the EU financial reporting directive about, all your nefarious activities that are not financial, that you're involved in, human rights abuses, so on and so forth. You have the UK Modern Slavery, UK and Australian Modern Slavery Act, which, basically is about you not paying people enough or not paying people enough at all. Would you say that an unpaid internship is modern slavery?
From a moral standpoint, yes.
Why? Has anyone ever
Labor is
been an unpaid intern? Okay. Has your company ever offered unpaid internships?
The
It's
Senate-
okay, you can come forward.
the Senate does.
The
Our-
Senate does? So are you saying that the constitution making body in the Philippines is involved in modern slavery?
Ma'am, have you heard about Michael Sandel?
No.
Oh, this is a professor at Harvard who lectures on philosophy and morality. And he said that even tax is a kind of slavery because the government takes away from you your money and you work for the yeah, that's one way of looking at it from that from many philosophers.
It's so funny that you have, sometimes you have these debates which have really existed for centuries in different contexts. In my past life, prior to coming to AIM, I used to teach Islamic jurisprudence in Pakistan because it's part of the curriculum. And there are actual debates in Central Asia, in the Middle East, about taxation itself. Like there are actual scholars from like 700, 800, 1,000 years ago who say, it's better to cut off a man's arms than to take taxes, extraneous taxes, right? Why? Because you're really taking away that person's property. So yes, technically speaking, that's true. But let's get back to those poor unpaid interns. You've all been unpaid interns? Did you feel like slaves? Who were those slave masters? In my case, it was the law firm I was working at. Yeah, I would like to see how, how I could get away with suing the best lawyers in the country for being slavers. But yeah, yes, Jody.
Working as an OJT or on the job training or internship is that is labor and that is the pretty property of the person who like them, like my classmate. It's really their property. Your labor is your own property. And that has been sanctioned by philosophers also, like John Locke.
Okay.
So, Prof,
Yes,
is
AJ.
OJT, the discussion, OJT is a type of slavery? I just want to understand. Sorry, I didn't catch it.
Yeah, in philosophical sense, it is maybe actually too. It is a form of slavery because under the principles of our society, your labor belongs to you. It's your own property. It is considered as your property. And because they don't pay you, it's like giving to them involuntarily because you need it. You need the internship. Involuntary. You're giving away your labor to them without payment. Yes.
Maybe if you could just turn on the mic.
Yeah, one of my mates, my neighbor, a friend, his son is going to go for an OJT in a certain firm here in the Philippines. He was signed for a waiver and everything. So would that get a consensus so that parents allowed him to accept the OJT?
Again, ma'am, consent sometimes count, but counts. Sometimes consent does not count. In this particular case, he because he needs the OJT for his school, right?
Precisely
The
right.
others, no.
Yeah, or else he will not pass the course or
So
something,
therefore, the
graduate.
consent there appears to be what do you call that? A vice. It's not real consent. So therefore, he is being a slave. He will become a
So in
slave.
short, attorney is still a slavery, even though the parents of my mates sign it, a waiver or something like that.
Or if you receive credit,
I think so.
school credit.
Do they want to collect?
Actually, the son is paying his transportation
Yeah.
and his food.
Let's maybe you can hire a lawyer to try this.
And
Try to
of
collect
the
money.
record, it's the school called LaSalle here. It's the one who's doing like that one. Okay.
Sorry, do you,
I'm trying to recall here because I mean to balance it off, you cannot graduate without certain hours.
yeah.
And to me, just thinking about it's like a barter. That I you give me my requirement, I learn from you my incompetence. So I'm going to instead of me paying for training or something, it's an on the job in exchange for the help I'm giving. And this is what I'm trying to recall, but I couldn't. Like there might be some that the student would have to pay. There is, right? Yeah, so I'm not dreaming here. The
Okay.
students will have to pay to accept for them to be accepted to do OJT.
So it seems like, maybe what I try here is, it seems like a reasonable bargain, right? So when does a reasonable bargain become exploitation? That's the question. Yes, KB.
This happens a lot in the medical field, especially with like nurses, doctors, medtechs, PTs, where we pay a bucket load of money just to avail that OJT experience. It's not intended to be a form of slavery. The slavery kicks in when the staff or the trainers abuse the trainees by super long hours of work. For example, they're only required to work for 8 hours on that day, and then the senior staff would require them, okay, so you do this and you do that, additional 2 hours, additional 4 hours, without any form of compensation already. Because if they will not comply, if the students will not comply, there would be sanctions from the senior staff. It happens a lot in the medical field. The students are left with no options but to comply. It's like the master and the slave.
Right. I mean, just to add to what led to this legislation in the UK first and then in Australia, is that there was an entire illegal immigration industry behind this. And so you would have companies that would, these fake job agencies that have, these immigrants who come from developing countries are trying to escape really bad situations at home, and they're manipulated into coming to these places, and then their passports are taken. They can't go to the government because they're illegal immigrants, so on and so forth, right? And so there's a mass level of exploitation, right? And I'm sure there are many Filipinos who understand this because it has happened with people who go to Arab countries, right? Like it happens to Pakistanis at least who go for these construction jobs, in the Middle East, right? They would have the employers take away their passports. So even if they wanted to leave, they couldn't do this. It happens with a lot of Filipino helpers who go there. Like there's increasing scrutiny behind this, but this is, you know, these things were happening in the UK as well, in Australia, and so that was the motivation behind having these modern slavery acts. However, these acts don't really have any real teeth to them, and I'll get to that in a bit, right? Then you have, in terms of other disclosure focused legislation, so you know, you have to talk about, okay, with these slavery acts, you have to talk about, okay, how much am I paying people? How many hours are they working? There are going to be external audits, especially across the supply chain. And that's why, you know, especially with Australian, if you have an Australian backed payment office, you will often see them coming to the Philippines, coming to Pakistan or wherever it is, and doing like on the ground inspections, because they're required to do this by the law, right? And so you know, they have to disclose, okay, we've made a back payment office in the Philippines. This is the amount of workers. These are the facilities. Do they have air conditioning? Do they have, like, you know, proper breaks in between? How are they working exactly, right? Okay, so then you have the Dodd-Frank Act, which, like I mentioned, incorporates the OECD guidance on critical minerals, you know, minerals. This has to do with the mining of minerals. They're called the 3 Ts. I'm not a scientist and an engineer, so I've forgotten exactly what the names are, but I think it's tungsten and so on. And then the G is gold. It's in there in my slides somewhere. Then you have due diligence legislation in both, not just the EU as a whole, but in also specific EU countries like France and Germany, where you know, if you are a public French company with 500 or more employees, then you have like certain due diligence requirements. You know, if you're not complying, you could be penalized by fines of more than 2% of your annual turnover or 3% of your annual turnover, depending on you know, the type of company you're operating. And then there's also the proposed EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which has not yet come into place, right? Then there are also sectoral regulations about timber, deforestation, so on and so forth. And also the US, I mean, it's more of a political thing, but the US also, you know, the US is really farsighted when it comes to human rights abuses. Doesn't look at where it is at, but it really is to, you know, sort of put pressure on China to like you know, behave the way it wants it to. It has the US Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act to, you know, see whether there are like Uyghur slaves that are working in this Chinese supply chain. But, you know, really it is acting as more of like a, you know, a political tool against China. So I'm going to leave it at that and not go too much into it.
I have a professor.
Yes.
I have a professor when I was taking my course in the University of Santo Tomas. He's a Frenchman. He's a Canadian Frenchman.
Right.
He's a doctor of civil law and also a doctor of geopolitical science or geopolitics. And he said that everything is political. That's his view. Everything, even on the acceptance of airplanes in one's airport, that is decided by the state that owns the airport. They consider political, you know, they're very political. Maybe that's how he sees it.
Of course, you know, when we break things down, every government action has some political element to it. So, yeah.
US wants hegemony. They want to remain the hegemon.
Of course, Of course. And you know, what's interesting is, just to add to this, I think this was a student of political science at the University of Toronto way back. You know, you find such interesting theorists in like these leading universities. And you know, he was talking about why should these Western countries maintain their hegemony, right? The whole idea is that if we don't do it, somebody else will. There's going to be a power gap anyway, so it might as well just be us. Does that make sense?
Yes, depending if it's a Machiavellian approach, then yes, it does. Because, ma'am, in my view, because I read some literature on this, and in world affairs, might is still right. Law is a fiction. Sovereignty, you know, equality of states is fiction. It's not real. According to the realists, might is right. Still, that is the dominant view in world politics.
Well, I mean, yes, it's true, but how do you look at might, right? I mean, I've seen, at least in Pakistan, even where you have some sort of hegemony, at the end of the day, there are limits to government power as well.
That's right.
No matter how hegemonic you get and how much wealth you accumulate or how much military power you have, at the end of the day, the individual citizens who might not individually have power will collectively have some sort of power. And so there are limits to state power and even like multinational, like state hegemony as well. You know, I'm saying this so that you realize that you have a voice. And just an apology, I just realized there was 5,000 employees and not 500 with France. So there's that. Okay. So these laws in general will require you to come up with some sort of risk management framework, right? In the French case, this is called a vigilance plan that you need to show the authorities that, you know, this is what we have in place. If we are a company that is more than 5,000 employees in France, or, you know, if we're operating elsewhere and we're a French company, more than 10,000 employees in the total world, right? And we'll also cover parent companies, not so if you're planning on having a subsidiary to hide from the law and you're French, good luck. It's not going to help you. They're going to pierce the corporate veil and get to you. And the same goes for any established business relationships you have. Okay, so the liability here is not criminal, it's mostly civil, but it will cost you. It's the same thing with Germany mostly as well. And then we have the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. The scope will be 500 plus. So that's where I got confused with the 5,000 from France and the 500 from the EU. So EU companies with 500 plus employees and an annual turnover of 100 million euros. If you are non-EU companies and you are operating in the EU, then it means you know, you'll be covered if you are if you have an annual turnover of 150 million euros, right? And so if you're a high impact sector like energy or, you know, some critical infrastructure related company, then the thresholds for you will be even lower, and so you have to be really you know, you'll have higher stringency requirements over there. Okay, so will the EU implement this? It will have national supervisory authorities. So this really, even though it's a top-down approach, it sort of gives more leeway to local authorities as to how they want to do this. And they've done this with competition law as well. The European Commission is the main competition regulator at the EU level, but you have local competition authorities in Germany, in France, so on and so forth, and they will implement the treaty, the regulations as they think is more appropriate for them in the local context. There could be administrative sanctions, civil liability provisions, and also director's duty of care expansion, then also compensation for victims of human rights abuses. The sustainability due diligence directive is a bit different from the corporate sustainability reporting directive, which aims to improve the sustainability reporting, basically aims to harmonize sustainability reporting throughout the EU, and we're going to get to that in the next lecture. Okay. Yeah, modern slavery, you can see it doesn't really have, you have these acts, but there are no penalties for non-compliance, basically no financial penalties. It's just more like due diligence, like disclosure requirements. Okay, you're required to have this, but if you don't, there's really no penalty in place for this. I mean, hopefully there will be some improvements, but at the moment, this is where it is. Then you have sectoral regulations in the EU, in the US as well, increasingly so in African countries too, related to timber, where's your timber coming from, how much are you using, so on and so forth. Then you have the EU conflict minerals regulation, which, by the way, again, was forced onto them by the US because they had the Dodd-Frank Act in place and they wanted to look good and they wanted to do business with Europe, but said, you know what, you don't have anything related to conflict minerals, right? So the conflict minerals are tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold. So these are the 3 TGs. And so most of the mining happens in places of conflict. And have you ever seen the movie Blood Diamond with Leonardo DiCaprio? Okay, so it's a good movie to understand how these conflict minerals operate, right? And you have these big companies like De Beers, like the diamond company, that will also, often benefit from people who are vulnerable in this. So yeah, there is that. And this is just like a comparison of the Dodd-Frank Act and the European Union regulation. Point is that wherever you're getting your minerals from, it has to be traceable. It has to be transparent and traceable. The deforestation regulation covers EU companies that are operating overseas. And so this is, and it's very specific to, really, really relevant to the Philippines because it's covering things like cacao and chocolate farmed here in the Philippines, coffee, soybeans, cattle and beef, right? So what this means basically is that these are all commodities, and you have these big giant like corporations like Nestle and Cargill. Have you ever heard of Cargill? one of the biggest commodity traders in the world. And most people don't know about it. Have also been involved in pushing for a lot of wars in some places, right? So what's the deforestation regulation is about is, okay, you are involved in these overseas activities that are basically commodity trading, right? And your activities could be potentially harmful to the environment. And so we want you to ensure that if you want to do business in the EU, you are not causing deforestation across your supply chain. So that is also like a due diligence requirement if you're, if you're operating.
Now, just a
Yes.
clarification, Professor, on the term due diligence. Diligence is an activity or set of activities required of companies
Yes.
by, for example, in our case in the Philippines, environmental impact assessment. Is that a due
So
diligence?
environmental impact assessments are mostly done with government level projects. Right? So I mean, or larger projects, like you might remember the annexes that I mentioned with the EU, right? So those are like more like infrastructure projects. Sometimes you'll have lower level projects like agricultural projects as well. What was your question again? Sorry, could you?
On the on the term due diligence, because earlier there was mentioned that due diligence is also applied by, like in the EU, there's due diligence requirement of corporations or states. And I get the idea that it's something like they are required to assess the risks, something like that, ma'am. Assess the risk and then take proactive measures in to address the risks that are involved in the supply chain. For example, there are possible risks that crop up in the supply chain, and then the companies are supposed to perform due diligence by assessing possible risks and then maybe preventing them, or that's how I get. Is that accurate?
Yes. And there is, at least in the US, there is something called the Caremark test. And the Caremark test is basically, I'll go into the details when we study business liability and insurance. But what that means is that boards of directors can be held liable for not having compliance programs in place. So they can be held personally liable. And so that's where a lot of the due diligence comes into place. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I actually want to get to Shell. Right.
No,
Okay.
it's like one question, ma'am.
Yes.
For the EU leading the game here because of the examples previously shared, right? So would you say that in EU they're already embodying right is might, or are they leveraging on a different kind of might and protecting the environment? Because it's sad for, like, as a Filipino, it's sad that we grow coffee here, we grow cacao here, but we import so much coffee, we drink so much Starbucks in this nation, right? Instead of exporting our coffee, and same with chocolates, right? It's like we don't know what we have and we're not taking care of it. But EU is protecting not just the environment, but the health of their citizens. So, in your view, is that right is might, or it's still might is right, but they're drawing from a different kind of might in the EU?
You know, the EU does have money, and which is also why it will force the United States to do things that it doesn't want to do. And this also goes for tech companies. Some of the first compliance related sanctions on Facebook or Google for their overreach actually happen in the EU, right? And it's the same thing with a lot of the environmental stuff. So I wouldn't be surprised going forward, especially with Trump in power, and this has happened in the past as well, where even if the US doesn't want to be scrupulous, the EU will force them to be. Right? And so
How about, ma'am, the alliance of Canada and China on trade of oil? Because if I'm not
quite frankly, I'm not following that too much, because there were major issues with China and Canada because of Huawei, and so I haven't followed that in a bit. But uh, the relationship is not of 100% trust.
we studied on the in situ, and now in situ we have the in situ case that we studied. And I saw on TV, I'm not sure if it's an AI on YouTube, Trump, about uh, China now withdrawing demand from the states and uh,
Withdrawing money.
seeking oil, or getting their oil now from Canada and others, and then one other state, Russia.
Well, I mean, it's a possibility. We already know that the alliance between China and Russia is quite close.
Lang, ma'am. Only on trade, not on none. But of course, trade is also related to politics.
Of course, I mean, the thing is, especially because like Canada is also looking for partners outside the US now, right? So you'll come up with alliances that you were not previously comfortable with, and so you'll have these marriages of convenience, as I understand.
To our case study, ma'am, I think that with this development, if this is true, that China will be seeking oil, or will be getting oil from Canada, then maybe the caps that were imposed by the state of Canada, or the regulatory agencies, will now be maybe lessened or mitigated
I don't know, because
of the demand.
well, maybe, but the thing is, Canadians are super woke. The Conservative Party lost by a heavy majority, like it lost quite badly, right? So there's an identity crisis going on in Canada. They don't want to be the US. They don't want to be the US's puppy dog. But also, as far as my experience living there, people are really vocal about environmental issues. They're super vocal. Like, even if they're voted, like, most of them will vote liberal just because they don't want conservatives. But the NDP is also really powerful on the ground, right? So, like, people will be voting liberal just because they don't want the conservatives coming into power strategically. It's a strategic move for a lot of Canadians. But that doesn't mean that just because they've voted Mark Carney or Justin Trudeau into power, that they're not going to say anything. And so, at least on the local level, I can see a lot of Canadians being super upset if, like, if you don't have environmental controls in place. So, I mean, let's see, in the words of Chairman Mao about the French Revolution, it's too soon to say. Yeah, somebody asked him about the French Revolution, and he like, what are the consequences of the French Revolution? He said, it's too soon to say. I don't think I don't think people understand the joke, but um, but anyway, let's just leave it at that. Anyway, let's get to Shell. Shuri, I'm not going to let you off the hook that easily. So we know there are problems, some problems with Shell, right? And I just want to know, in this particular case, what happened? Did Shell take any measures that increased or mitigated its risk exposure? I won't put Shruti on the hook now, right now. Somebody else can respond to this. So we know that there were problems with Shell, not just on the Niger Delta, but also on the, even on the local level in the EU, right? What was the issue in the Shell case? I think if you answer that question, Judy, you're not going to be liable by your company. It's purely factual. Yes, Senate.
The main issue here, Prof, is that should Shell reduce its CO2 emission by 2030?
Yes, KB.
Also, Prof, does a multinational corporation like Shell owe a legal duty of care to mitigate climate change under Dutch law?
Okay. Good. Did Shell take any actions that increased or mitigated its risk exposure as per the case study? Yes, Jody.
Thank you, Professor. Yes, but the court did not see it as a serious effort
Okay.
to.
What was the measure that it? I'm assuming you mean that they tried to mitigate its.
They try to mitigate, but they plan to mitigate, but the plan is to the court not sufficient because what they were targeting is merely 25%. Was it 25%? But the court less than what they should, less than what the court had imposed on them, which is about 45% CO2 reduction. And the court also found that Shell um, Shell was mm, let me I forgot, ma'am. Just 1 second. Shell was not serious, and that Shell was I forgot. I'll try to recover, ma'am. 1 second.
Okay. So the upshot is that the court didn't buy Shell's arguments. Okay. Right. So the court ordered 45% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030.
Yeah,
Yes.
I remember now, ma'am.
Yeah.
Please allow me to.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, because Shell, according to the court, Shell made its compliance contingent or dependent on society's progress, efforts at reduction. So the court did not see that as an earnest effort to really comply with the required reductions. So that's what. Thank you, ma'am, for that.
Yes, G.
My recollection of the case is that Shell has set targets, but the how isn't very much documented. So which kind of in my view, in my interpretation, the court says that's not enough and set stringent measures to such 45% by this year.
So it was too broad,
It was
basically.
the how that's missing.
The how is missing, basically. So the what is there, but the how is missing. Okay. Now, in terms of public international law, this case was was a landmark case. Why? Because the Paris Agreement is meant to be just for states. But it was the first time in the history of public international law where a private enterprise was recognized as a person in public international law and was ordered to comply with the Paris Agreement. Now, this wasn't the only challenge that Shell faced. There have been cases against the Shell board of directors in the UK. And also a lot of, so you can see here, you know, a lot of, there was litigation in Nigeria for polluting the rivers as well. And yeah. So there have been securities litigation over climate disclosures, shareholder resolutions, which is a UK case on climate targets, and then investigations into alleged greenwashing. And we're going to get into greenwashing a bit later as to how not just Shell, but other companies do this, right? So if you were AZE, how would you go about formulating your corporate strategy and policy with reference to everything that has happened with Shell? Do you want to take first dibs, Andre? He's dreading it. He's like, no, not me.
Okay. If I were AZ's board,
Mhm.
well, if I'm going to be very honest, I'm to be in the board. Well, if I'm going to adopt the argument of the Shell case, it's very difficult for a board member in AZE to depart from what Shell did. Personally, I would probably advocate for not to do what Shell did, but really to comply for what the court said. But if I'm going, it's just that I know how it feels to be grilled by shareholders. Oh my god. Hmm.
It's okay. You're not in Judy's position. You can actually have a confession here.
Okay, because in Shell's one of the in Shell's what's that term? Um Shell the Shell ownership or the board. Wait, hold on. I'm trying to say it the right way. Complying with the court or reducing their carbon footprint it will take a lot of significant investment on the Shell's part. But um, in doing so, the Shell shareholder, there was no consensus among the shareholders of the Shell to put that amount of money and reduce their carbon footprint or their is it what's the okay. So if my if I'm AZE, I would ask my shareholders what their sentiments are. I'm going to present factual numbers. Say how much would it cost to do this and that? What are the effects? Uh Short-term effects, long-term effects from our business. And of course their shareholdings or and then if we I'm going to after presenting those facts, I'm going to advocate my personal take on the matter and risk. I'm just going to advocate my personal take, which is we should be environmentally responsible, sustainable, and go for it. And then if my, but unfortunate, well, I'm going with what the direction my shareholders will take me.
Okay. Joaquin, what do you think about that? What's your input? Thanks, Andre.
If I would be on advice A's. Number one is acknowledge that the company has a responsibility of environmental responsibility. Then second, with the Shell case, I would make a concrete and ambition on in terms of reduction of emission. Like in the Shell case, 45%. So that would be the benchmark number, that the numbers that we will reduce. Second is third is the create a credible detailed plan. Then systematic investment with regarding to sustainability or renewable energy for the transition. And lastly is the disclosure and reporting with regards to climate-related risks.
Okay, excellent. So Chudi, how did Shell respond to all this climate litigation from all these different actors? What do you have in place? Have things changed in the company in the last 5 to 6 years?
Yes, ma'am. Number one would be the investments. As far as I know, what we're told is Shell is the biggest company with the biggest investment to made for renewables. That's one. Locally in the Philippines, we've already renamed Shell. It's no longer called petroleum has been removed from the company name. So it's no longer called Filipina Shell Petroleum Corporation. It's now called Shell Pilipinas Corporation. We've also sold the Malampaya plant, and the Tabangao refinery has been turned into just an import-export facility. There's also big investment and big deployment already when it comes to the charging stations, even if the market is only at 2% or less than 2%. Those are the top things. But publicly, there are statistics available also when it comes to the Shell's overall global compliance to the demands of higher court. Yes.
Okay, so I mean, I see that as more of like external measures. Have you seen change in company culture over time, or have things remained the same? What about like the standard operating procedures? Have things remained the same, or have they changed?
Oh, they've changed a lot, ma'am, especially since during the pandemic. In terms of org structure, like for biz law class, when we talked about the valve case, a lot of it already applies to Shell, even before the pandemic, actually. But since the pandemic, restructuring takes place like more frequently. Like I'm probably gonna be impacted again as starting next week. The only difference with Shell and Valve is for Valve they can self-organize, right? Because they're creatives and there's a no boss rule, so they can self-organize. But for a company like Shell, it's more managed. But yes, a lot of what's happening, or a lot of the new age methodologies or organizational structures that we discussed in the Valve case, we're also already encountering ahead of time and much more frequently now. And in terms of company purpose, that has been updated also. Even for benefits, for example, since I'm from HR, I cannot forget about that. We're we start with ourselves. Like for example, in terms of decarbonization and lessening cars on the road, and we started with our executives. We no longer have car plans, and we started with executives. So it's not diminution of benefits because we just converted the car benefit to cash. So but we no longer provide the car or a new car as soon as let's say for salespeople, when the loan expires, Shell pays for the loan. When the loan expires, you get to have a choice if you're a salesperson, to buy a new car, right? And then employees make money out of it because they sell the old car. So we stop doing that. It now becomes a personal imperative. If you want to use your benefit, your cash benefit, to add to the number of cars on the road, or you want to extend the life cycle of your existing car. And we started with our employee executives. And we have sustainability related benefits also. So what I'm saying is, from people, or let's start from the top, from structure to ways of working, to business principles and practices, down to people, and also benefits and values. Um, I'm proud to say we have enacted changes across the board, and they continue.
What about communication mechanisms? Because in a lot of organizations that are dysfunctional, there is a disconnect between the buzz at the bottom and the tone at the top, right? So how, like, have there been changes or things have remained the same? Like what's happening at that level?
Like I shared in BizLaw class, we've flattened the organization. That's one. So there's more interaction, and there's very little gap now between middle managers and executive level managers or leaders. Even I as an advisor, even if I'm, say, 3 or 4 job grades below a global executive or a senior executive, I have direct contact. I could just go to them, and actually I advise them. And my LT mates, they were actually surprised that I can just call UK legal team and consult.
Really?
Yes, yes. So in preparation for this, I got to talk to our local legal team and corporate relations team, but also from the UK. I realize it's not common practice in the Philippines, but where I come from, I can just ping them. We have that culture. And then in terms of values and meditation, in terms of mindfulness, how we practice that, we have a lot of coaches. We have coaching circles, and our organizational development and leadership consultants from across the globe. They actually do executive coaching, and they facilitate team workshops that are sometimes termed as wishy-washy by the traditional folks, or those who are not used to it, because we are really injecting new age, new practices, like injecting theory, updating our models, what used to be called, let's say, soft skills. We have updated our leadership frameworks. So from HR, I'm involved in that too. And that's also what led me to becoming a professional coach, because there's a shift already. And having been with Shell for 20 years, I really see the shifts taking place, and what leadership looks like today, what learner mindset looks like today, when in the past I was probably the only homeschooled student in the entire Philippines. But now we have to teach everyone about learner mindset. Yeah, from a values-led perspective, the frameworks have changed, and the coaching models, level of engagement, they've changed. And you'll see the tone also from the voice of leaders from all levels, not just at the executive level.
Okay, excellent. So the upshot of today's lesson is that the scope of supply chain due diligence is increasing, and its intensity is also increasing as well, right? In terms of strategic risk management, you don't want to be reactive. You should actually take a more proactive approach to managing your environmental risks. Janie, I saw that you raised your hand. I'm sorry we didn't get around to you. Please, I would love to hear your input.
Oh, yes. Actually, I just want to share a bit about what the shells they are doing right now in the Philippine market. Actually, they have this RES license. So, firstly, the RES license costs a lot every year, and it has its strict standards for keeping it still valid. Similar as the other big company like Aboitiz, they all have this RES lessons. And yes, I just want to share about this part that the shares they're also under doing something to make the environment more better. Yeah.
So they're putting money into it.
Janie, how come you didn't sign with us?
I know. Because our project is going to sign with Abortis instead of Shell.
Just kidding.
But still, the maintaining fee for this RES license also a lot.
So how much does it cost? Roughly.
Derek, can you please answer this question?
As far as I know that the people would like to be the RES, they have to at least put the $1 million as a deposit into the government account. This is the threshold. Yeah.
Okay. So not a small amount, right? But I'm sure it's peanuts for Shell. Yes, Jody.
If I may be allowed to just think aloud on some parts of the case study, there is a mention that the Shell decision was the first time a court used private law against a private sector. So I think he was referring to the civil code of Netherlands. So, but there's also a mention of the Paris
Agreement.
Agreement. So what really was violated? Was it the private law, or is it the Paris Agreement, or is it both?
Short answer, both.
All right. Okay.
Right.
And then there's the other one also, ma'am, on page 7. Was just a critique. Okay, here, page 7. It said it says the court thus found Shell's policy intentions, and ambitions which have not been realized as implied an imminent breach. So there was no breach yet. It's just imminent. Although, of course, imminent means almost there. Of the group's duty to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. So this is the first time, or maybe I've seen this before, but I don't remember that just a critique, ma'am, that the decision frowned up, decided against a policy when there is no damage yet. Policy intentions, there are sanctioned because of this. Intentions only and ambitions only. So
Yeah.
just a critique.
That's so this is not like I was mentioning, this is not new, right? So there are Delaware Chancery Court decisions against US corporations for not having the right programs, the right policies. So I mean, I'm not going to go into too much detail for that because that's more of a compliance and risk management. Like, when you study business liability and insurance, that is more in that realm. But short, yeah, you can be held liable. That's and that this is not the only jurisdiction where that's the
Or lack of policy,
yeah.
or how about policy intentions?
Also for that, if it's not
Or
good enough,
ambitions.
and this is like also broadly speaking, it's also a critique in the US where with these Caremark cases, right? So it's like the Chancery Court said you need to have a compliance program, but then what happens is that the board of directors will come up with something that is very convenient, right? And so there is increasing scrutiny as to what your compliance policy looks like. So that's the upshot of where we're at. And with that, before we end.
The question, Prof, is that why in 2024 it was reappealed and Shell won because of what Attorney Dodi is pointing out? Could be.
Yeah, people are still upset, right? So, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if more and more oil companies get targeted. They have already been targeted in the past, and you have increasing scrutiny of multinational companies in general, and especially for human rights claims, environmental claims. It's becoming more ubiquitous.
One
So-
last point, ma'am, about the one raised by Shell, that it should be the government to spearhead. I think there's a statement, and the court didn't frowned upon that assertion by Shell, that it should be the government who should lead the campaign. So maybe yes, maybe no also. So
it's a double-edged sword, right?
I'm undecided on that.
Sometimes what happens is like what the, in practice, a lot of multinational companies hold more power than actual governments. Like I've actually seen research where, and again, this is something that there was a paper presented at Harvard, and he's a Canadian researcher. I think his name is George Simon, or I've forgotten what his name is, but he was talking about how some companies have their own judicial system. Yeah. Because of their reach, their might. Yeah, they have the might and the money, right? Like, so you will see that they can have a lot more power than states. So that's probably where this judgment is coming from, right? Like recognizing that there is a lot more power involved than meets the eye, than meets the formal process involved here. So,
Ma'am, on
Yes.
that one, I can't remember if it's 2022 or 2023, but Shell released its first lobbying report that outlines efforts and outcomes when it comes to relations with the government.
yeah, I mean, like I've seen the union side of this as well. If a union is based in a developed country, they have more power than they're incredibly powerful. Like I was talking about the United Steelworkers. It's an amalgamated union. So it's sort of like a byproduct of a corporation, right? You have these workers' rights unions, and even these like low level workers that are really steel workers can hire their whole lobby group. They have a super PAC. They can they're actually in Washington all the time. And what they pride themselves over is that they have the best litigators. So you don't want to be, if the United Steelworkers is involved in a case, be ready to lose
Ma'am,
on the other side.
I've been to Washington D.C. and we've met some lobbyists who are very, very powerful in Washington D.C.
Right. So I mean, it's a given. Like these corporations have lobbies. They so yeah. I mean, the upshot is it's about time in some ways, right? And that also leads to how some companies now are reporting on some of their lobbying activities. Also, by the way, a product of increasing financial disclosures or disclosure requirements. Anyway, we're almost half hour. We're almost more than half hour over our time limit. There's going to be compliance and due diligence done on me for not ending this lecture on time. But see you all next week. Also, I wanted to tell you you have another WAC due on May 14th. That is the rhinoceros horn trade case study. Yes. I will post the instructions by Tuesday, and that will be up on Alice. But if you want to start preparing early, you might just want to read the case study over the weekend. Okay. So see you then. And we have a makeup class on Wednesday, just an hour and a half. And then on Saturday, we will have a resource speaker coming.
Prof, is the WAC by learning team or individual?
They're all individuals. If you look at the course outline and you look at the requirements, I have clearly pointed out which components of your assessments are individual. So all WACs are individuals, or the reflection papers are individual, the class participation is individual, and then you have the final group project, which is not individual. That's based on your learning team. So that will be your presentations and the final report that you will submit, right? So it's all clearly, like, if you look at the course outline, you can see this before the course schedule. It's all there. Okay. Okay. Take care.